People have survived the Sahara for weeks with almost no water, not because they were stronger, but because they learned how to lose less. What sounds impossible was once routine, repeated quietly by those who had no room for error. Every step, every breath, every moment of waiting became part of a careful balance between life and collapse. These were not legends or extreme experiments, but ordinary human responses shaped by heat, scarcity, and discipline. The methods were simple, the consequences unforgiving, and the margin for survival painfully thin. Tonight, you will walk through this world of restraint, patience, and silent decisions, where staying alive meant learning how not to waste a single drop. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the edge of the Sahara and look out across the land, the first thing one would notice is not silence, but emptiness. Not the peaceful emptiness of an open field, but a vast, punishing absence that seems to reject the idea of human life altogether. The horizon stretches without relief, the ground pale and cracked, the air already heavy even in the early hours of the morning. This is not a place that welcomes visitors. It is a place that tests them. The Sahara is often spoken of as a desert, but that word feels too gentle. It suggests stillness, perhaps even beauty. In reality, the Sahara is a boundary. Beyond it, the rules that govern ordinary human life begin to break down. Water, the most basic requirement for survival, is almost absent. Rainfall in many regions is so rare that years can pass without a single meaningful drop. When rain does fall, it vanishes quickly, swallowed by sand and heat before it can offer comfort. Temperatures rise without mercy. During the day, the ground can burn hotter than 50 degrees Celsius, turning sand into something closer to metal than soil. The sun presses down with a weight that feels physical, draining moisture from skin and breath alike. Sweat does not cool the body here, it betrays it. Every drop that escapes the skin is a loss the body cannot afford. By night, the desert shifts again. The heat collapses, replaced by cold that cuts just as sharply. Survival requires enduring both extremes, often within the same day. To live in the Sahara is to exist on borrowed time. Each morning begins with calculation. How far can one walk before the sun becomes dangerous? How much water remains, and how fast will it disappear? Every movement has a cost. Every mistake is punished quickly. There is no margin for error, no room for comfort. Even standing still too long under the open sky can be fatal. For those unfamiliar with the desert, the Sahara appears empty, as though nothing has ever lived there. This is an illusion. The land carries the marks of countless attempts at survival. Tracks fade quickly, camps vanish beneath shifting sand, and bones bleach white before breaking down into dust. The desert erases evidence efficiently. It does not need violence to kill. It only needs time. Human survival here has never been guaranteed. It has always been a gamble made against heat, thirst, and distance. A single wrong turn can separate a traveler from water forever. A delay of hours can mean the difference between reaching shade and collapsing in open sunlight. The Sahara does not announce its dangers loudly. It allows people to continue walking, believing they are safe, until their bodies quietly fail. What makes the Sahara especially unforgiving is not just the lack of water, but the way it hides what little exists. Water is not absent entirely. It is concealed. It lies beneath layers of sand, locked into rare pockets, or held briefly in plants that appear lifeless to an untrained eye. To the unprepared, the desert offers nothing. To those who know where to look, it offers just enough to survive, and never more. Over centuries, people have entered this land for trade, migration, or necessity, knowing that the journey itself could kill them. Entire routes across the Sahara were defined not by distance, but by water. A path existed only if it could connect one source to another. Villages rose and fell depending on wells that could dry without warning. A thriving settlement could vanish in a single generation if the water beneath it failed. The idea of comfort has no place here. Survival becomes the only measure of success. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion are constant companions, not emergencies. The body adapts slowly, learning to conserve, to endure, to function with less. But even adaptation has limits. The desert does not care how experienced someone is. It treats the strong and the weak the same when water runs out. For outsiders, it is difficult to imagine living in such conditions for more than a few days. Yet for thousands of years, people have done exactly that. They have crossed these sands not once, but repeatedly, building lives within a landscape that appears hostile to life itself. Their existence challenges the idea that humans require abundance to survive. In the Sahara, survival is built on restraint. The desert forces a different understanding of time. Days stretch endlessly under the sun, while moments of shade feel brief and fragile. Progress is slow, measured not in miles but in survival until nightfall. Each evening is a quiet victory. Each sunrise is a reminder that the trial begins again. What stands out most is how ordinary this danger becomes to those who live with it. The threat of dehydration, heat stroke, and disorientation does not arrive suddenly. It lingers constantly, shaping behavior and thought. The desert teaches caution through repetition. Those who ignore it do not last long enough to repeat their mistakes. In many ways, the Sahara represents the final boundary between human ambition and natural limits. It strips life down to essentials and exposes how fragile the body truly is. There are no shortcuts here, no modern conveniences that can fully overcome its conditions. Even today, with technology and transport, the desert remains capable of killing quietly and efficiently. Standing at its edge, one understands that survival in the Sahara is not heroic or dramatic. It is slow, careful, and deeply uncertain. It is a daily decision to continue, knowing that the land offers no guarantees. The desert does not promise survival. It merely allows it, briefly, to those who understand its rules. This land turns heat, thirst, and distance into constant threats, forcing life into a narrow space where mistakes cannot be undone. Yet beyond this first layer of danger lies something less visible, knowledge passed quietly from one generation to another. Somewhere beneath the sand, the desert holds signs that only certain eyes know how to read. The Sahara was not always empty of people. Long before modern maps marked it as a vast blank space, humans were already moving across its sands, learning its patterns, and deciding where life could still be held together. The desert did not invite settlement, but it did not prevent it either. Those who stayed did so not because it was easy, but because they learned how to bend their lives around scarcity. Among the earliest and most enduring inhabitants were the Berber and Tuareg peoples. Their presence in the Sahara stretches back thousands of years, so far that the beginning is no longer clear. There was no single moment when they arrived and claimed the land. Instead, there was a slow adjustment, generation after generation, as families learned which areas could support them and which would kill them. Settlement here did not mean building cities or permanent homes. It meant understanding movement. Life in the Sahara required flexibility above all else. The idea of staying in one place forever was dangerous. Water sources could vanish, grazing land could dry up, and familiar paths could become traps. The Berber and Tuareg developed ways of living that allowed them to move without losing their identity. Tents replaced stone houses. Possessions were limited to what could be carried. Wealth was measured in animals, knowledge, and relationships rather than land. These communities did not conquer the desert. They negotiated with it. Daily life revolved around restraint. Food was eaten slowly, and water was carefully measured. Children were taught early that comfort was temporary and that excess was a liability. Nothing in their environment allowed waste. Every object had a purpose, and every habit was shaped by survival. The harshness of the Sahara created a different sense of time. History was not recorded in books, but in memory. Elders carried knowledge that could not be written down easily. They remembered where water once appeared after rare storms. They knew which valleys hid moisture beneath the sand and which hills should never be crossed at certain times of year. This information was shared quietly, often without explanation. Children learned by watching, walking, and repeating the same routes. Language itself adapted to the desert. Directions were given not just by distance but by risk. Certain paths were spoken of with caution, others with confidence. A place could be described as safe or dangerous depending on the season, the wind, or the behavior of animals nearby. Maps were not drawn, they were lived. The Tuareg, in particular, became known for their ability to navigate vast distances with little visible guidance. They read the desert through subtle signs that outsiders would miss entirely. A change in sand texture, the position of stars, or the movement of birds could determine whether a journey continued or stopped. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was proven again and again through survival. What is striking is how ordinary this way of life became for those born into it. Children did not grow up fearing the desert in dramatic ways. Instead, they grew up respecting it. Fear was replaced by routine. The desert was dangerous, but danger was familiar. It did not feel extraordinary. It was simply the condition of life. The memory of survival became a form of inheritance. Stories were told not to entertain, but to warn. A tale about a lost traveler was not a legend, it was instruction. A story about a dried well was a reminder to never trust a single source of water. These memories shaped behavior more strongly than rules ever could. Over time, the Sahara changed, and so did the people. Climate shifts altered landscapes that had once been less hostile. Areas that supported life slowly became more barren. Those who survived were the ones who adapted again, abandoning places that could no longer sustain them. The desert did not reward loyalty, it rewarded awareness. Outside observers often misunderstood this way of life. To settled societies, constant movement appeared unstable or primitive. In reality, it was a calculated response to uncertainty. Permanence was a risk. Flexibility was protection. What looked like wandering was, in fact, careful planning stretched across generations. The endurance of these communities challenges modern assumptions about progress. While empires rose and fell elsewhere, the Berber and Tuareg maintained a continuity rooted in survival rather than expansion. Their history was not written in monuments, but in persistence. The desert erased physical traces of their past, but it could not erase their presence. Even today, fragments of this ancient knowledge remain. Some routes are still remembered. Some wells are still used. The desert has grown harsher, but the memory of how to live within it has not disappeared entirely. It lingers in habits, in caution, and in stories told quietly under open skies. This long history reveals something uncomfortable. Humans did not survive the Sahara by overcoming it with force or technology. They survived by accepting limits. They learned when not to move, when to wait, and when to turn back. Survival here was never about victory. It was about endurance. For thousands of years, people remained in this land by adjusting their lives to scarcity rather than resisting it. That endurance depended on knowledge so subtle it could vanish if not passed on carefully. What they learned to read in sand and silence would later become the difference between life and disappearance. Reading the Sahara begins with accepting that nothing announces itself clearly. The desert does not point to water or safety in obvious ways. Instead, it offers fragments, small disturbances in an otherwise uniform landscape. To survive, people learned to notice what others ignored. The ability to read these signs was not a skill taught formally. It was absorbed slowly, through repetition and attention. Insects were often the first clue. Certain beetles appeared only in areas where moisture lingered beneath the sand. Ant trails that seemed too organized, too persistent, suggested a hidden source nearby. Flies gathered where life could be sustained, even briefly. These details were easy to dismiss as meaningless movement, but to trained eyes, they formed patterns. In a land where nothing moved without reason, movement itself became information. Birds mattered even more. Small birds rarely strayed far from water, no matter how harsh the environment became. Their flight paths were watched closely. A bird traveling with purpose, rather than circling aimlessly, suggested a destination worth following. Large birds resting on the ground during heat often indicated shade or moisture close by. Hunters and travelers learned to pause and observe rather than rush forward. Watching birds costs nothing. Guessing costs lives. The ground itself carried memory. A shallow depression in the sand was not random. It often marked where water once flowed, sometimes long ago. These sunken lines could be ancient riverbeds, dry for generations yet still capable of guiding rain when it finally came. Even without water, these channels collected cooler air and trapped moisture below the surface. Digging there required effort, but effort was preferable to blind wandering. Such places were approached carefully. Dig too shallow, and nothing appeared. Dig too deep, and the sand collapses, burying both water and digger. Knowledge lies in knowing when to stop. People learned to feel the resistance of the ground, to sense when dampness was near. There were no measurements, only experience passed from hand to hand, from one generation to the next. Plants offered quieter signals. In a desert dominated by emptiness, even the smallest patch of green carried meaning. A single shrub surviving where nothing else grew suggested roots reaching something unseen. These plants did not waste energy growing tall or wide. They survived by drawing from what little remained below. Travelers learned to approach them slowly, examining the soil around their base rather than tearing them apart. Killing the plant often meant destroying the only guide to water. The presence of certain trees was especially significant. Acacia and tamarisk were never accidental. They grew only where underground moisture could support them. Their leaves might appear dry, their branches sparse, but their roots extended deep and wide. People learned to read the health of these trees. A tree leaning slightly or showing uneven growth could indicate the direction of water below. This reading of nature was not mystical. It was practical, learned through loss as much as success. Every mistake became a lesson repeated in warnings and stories. Someone who ignored the signs did not simply fail, they disappeared. The desert did not preserve bodies well. Bones scattered, tracks vanished, and soon there was no evidence left at all. What remained were the stories told afterward, meant to prevent repetition. Silence was another signal. Areas completely devoid of sound were often dangerous. Even in harsh conditions, life tended to gather where survival was possible. Absolute stillness suggested exhaustion, a place where nothing endured. People learned to be uneasy in such spaces, to move on rather than investigate further. Smell mattered too, though it was subtle. Damp earth carried a faint scent even through layers of sand. Those who grew up in the desert recognized it instinctively. Outsiders missed it entirely. The ability to sense moisture without seeing it separated survival from failure. Time played a role in reading these signs. Certain clues appeared only at dawn or dusk, when heat shifted and shadows changed. Tracks became visible briefly before fading again. Insects emerged during cooler hours. Birds moved differently at different times of day. Survival depended on patience, on knowing when to observe and when to act. What makes this knowledge fragile is how easily it can be lost. It cannot be written down effectively. A description on paper cannot replace standing in the heat, feeling the sand, and watching the horizon. When routes changed or communities were disrupted, this understanding faded quickly. Without constant practice, the desert became unreadable again. Modern travelers often underestimate this. Technology offers tools, but it does not replace attention. A map shows where water should be, not where it is now. The desert changes slowly, but it changes enough to punish certainty. Those who survived longest were not the most confident, but the most observant. Reading the Sahara meant accepting uncertainty. Signs never guarantee safety. They only increase the odds. A bird might mislead. A depression might be dry. A green plant might be surviving on the last traces of moisture. Survival required combining many signals, weighing them quietly, and deciding when the risk was acceptable. This way of living shaped behavior deeply. Movement slowed. Observation became a bit. People learned to trust what they saw and felt more than what they hoped. The desert rewarded those who listened carefully and punished those who assumed too much. Survival here depended on reading small signs that most people would never notice. Those signs were learned slowly, through attention and loss rather than instruction. Some of the most desperate choices were made only after these signals failed to appear. The decision to drink urine was never made lightly. It appeared only after every visible source of water had failed, when wells were dry, plants offered nothing, and movement itself threatened collapse. In the Sahara, thirst does not arrive as a dramatic crisis. It grows slowly, tightening the mouth, thickening the tongue, and dulling thought until judgment weakens without warning. By the time desperation becomes clear, the body is already close to its limit. Those who survived long periods without water understood that the body does not immediately waste every drop it releases. During the first stages of dehydration, urine still contains a significant amount of water. It is bitter, warm, and instinctively repulsive, yet it is not immediately fatal. People did not see it as nourishment or relief. They saw it as a delay. Drinking urine did not end thirst. It postponed collapse. This knowledge was never shared casually. Elders warned that it was a measure for emergencies only, used briefly and with care. The first attempt was usually small. A mouthful is swallowed slowly, followed by waiting in silence. The body's response mattered more than the act itself. Nausea was common. Vomiting meant loss, and loss could not be replaced. Those who forced too much too quickly often weakened faster than before. In the early phase, urine could reduce overall water loss by providing fluid without increasing sweating. The body, already deprived, entered a state of conservation. Every process slowed. Moisture was recycled, filtered again through the kidneys, and used once more. This cycle was fragile. It worked only for a short time. For 1 or 2 days, sometimes slightly longer, it allowed people to remain conscious and mobile. Some diluted it using damp sand or a cloth. The method was crude but deliberate. Sand collected moisture from cooler layers beneath the surface, especially in shaded areas or during the early morning. By passing urine through wet sand or fabric, the taste softened slightly, the bitterness less sharp. This was not filtration in a medical sense. It was psychological as much as physical. Making the liquid tolerable mattered when the body resisted every swallow. The danger increased quickly after the 2nd or 3rd day. As dehydration deepened, urine became more concentrated. Toxins that the body normally expels returned in higher amounts. Drinking it repeatedly turned delay into damage. Headaches intensified, muscles weakened, confusion followed. The same fluid that once helped has now accelerated poisoning. The body began to fail from within. Those who endured this period often remembered the mental strain more vividly than physical pain. Thirst distorted perception. Sounds felt distant. Movement slowed until even standing required effort. The act of drinking urine became mechanical, stripped of emotion. Survival reduced itself to repetition. There was no pride in it. There was only continuation. What is often misunderstood is that this practice was rarely attempted while continuing long travel. People did not rely on urine and kept walking blindly forward. That almost always led to death. Drinking urine was paired with stillness, with waiting, with seeking shade and conserving energy. Survival depended on reducing demand as much as replacing supply. The limits of this method were known through experience rather than explanation. Stories circulated quietly, warning of those who drank for too long and never recovered. Kidneys failed. Weakness lingered even after the rescue. Some survived the desert only to die later from damage done during those days. The Sahara allowed survival, but it demanded payment afterward. Children were rarely subjected to this unless no alternative existed. Their bodies were less capable of handling toxins. Adults often endured longer, so children could drink what little clean water remained. Decisions were made silently, without discussion. In such moments, survival became collective rather than individual. No one spoke of fairness. They acted according to necessity. To outsiders, the idea feels shocking, even grotesque. It violates modern instincts about cleanliness and safety. But in the Sahara, ordinary rules collapse quickly. What matters is not comfort but consequence. Drinking urine was not a reckless act born of panic. It was a known measure, remembered for moments when nothing else remained. The practice also reflected a deeper understanding of the body. Survival was not guided by taboo or shame. It was guided by function. The desert stripped away moral judgment. Anything that prolonged life without immediate death became a tool. Pride had no role here. This knowledge was passed quietly and reluctantly. It was never emphasized unless necessary. People hoped they would never need it, but they remembered it all the same. Forgetting could be fatal. Remembering was uncomfortable, but safer. Modern survival guides sometimes mention this practice without its context. Without restraint, timing, and stillness, it becomes dangerous advice. Those who survived knew when to stop. They understood that delaying death was not the same as escaping it. Timing mattered as much as action. In the Sahara, survival choices were rarely clean or admirable. They were practical, unpleasant, and temporary. Drinking urine did not make the desert kinder. It only widened a narrow space between endurance and collapse, long enough for another option to appear. When no water remained, survival depended on choices that felt wrong but postponed failure. That postponement mattered only if the body was kept still and demand was reduced. There were other forms of moisture, hidden where desperation rarely looked. Digging for water in the Sahara was never an act of optimism. It was an admission that everything visible had already failed. When wells were dry, containers empty, and plants offered nothing more than brittle shade, people turned to the ground itself. Not because it promised water, but because it sometimes hid it. The search always began in low places. Valleys, shallow basins, and slight depressions in the sand were studied carefully. These were not chosen at random. Over time, people learned that water, when it did appear, moved briefly before disappearing again. Even long after the surface dried, traces of that movement remained below. The lowest points collected more than sand. They collected memories. Digging was done slowly and with restraint. Hands were preferred over tools whenever possible. Metal or wood disturbed the sand too aggressively, causing collapse. Bare hands allowed control, allowing the digger to feel changes in temperature and texture. Cooler sand suggested depth. Slight resistance hinted at moisture. Every sensation mattered. The process demanded patience. Dig too fast, and the sides caved in. Dig too shallow and nothing appeared. Dig too deep, and the pit becomes a trap. People learned to stop before the sand turned unstable, to widen the hole slightly rather than deepen it recklessly. Survival depended on knowing when to stop as much as when to continue. Water, when found, did not rush upward. It seeped slowly, darkening the sand grain by grain. The first appearance was often disappointing. The liquid was cloudy, mixed with grit and fine particles. It was not water as people imagined it, clear and refreshing. It was heavy, thick, and warm, but it was water. Cloth played a quiet role in this process. A piece of fabric, often worn and already dirty, was placed carefully to catch the seepage. It absorbed moisture while holding back sand. The cloth was then wrung out into a container or directly into the mouth. The amount collected was small. Sometimes, only a few mouthfuls rewarded hours of work, yet those mouthfuls mattered. Filtering was never perfect. Sand passed through. The taste remained earthy. But the body cared less about clarity than hydration. People swallowed carefully, slowly, allowing the body to accept what it could without shock. Rushing led to vomiting. Vomiting meant loss, and loss could not be recovered. These pits were never left open. After collecting what was possible, the hole was partially filled again. Leaving it exposed allowed evaporation and collapse. More importantly, it prevented reuse. Knowledge was preserved by keeping the site usable. A pit might serve again after rest, when seepage resumed. Waste here was unforgivable. There was always risk. Digging costs energy. Energy is required for water. This balance had to be measured constantly. People watched each other closely. If someone weakened, the digging stopped. No amount of potential water justified a collapse. Survival required discipline more than effort. Children were rarely asked to dig. Their strength was limited, and their bodies were less tolerant of dehydration. Adults took on the work, often in silence. There was no encouragement or instruction shouted across the sand. Movements were careful, economical, and deliberate. Every gesture had been repeated many times before. Not every attempt succeeded. Many pits yielded nothing. Sand dried again. Moisture disappeared. In those moments, despair threatened to take hold, but people learned not to react emotionally. Digging was attempted, assessed, and abandoned without ceremony. Hope was dangerous. Acceptance was safer. The ground itself taught lessons. In some places, sand rested lightly, shifting easily. These areas were avoided. In others, it packed firmly, resisting collapse. These spots were favored. Even the color of sand mattered. Slightly darker tones often meant retained moisture below. These signs were subtle and easy to misread. Time mattered as much as place. Digging during the heat of the day wasted effort. Moisture evaporated quickly. Early morning and evening offered better chances. Cooler air allowed seepage to remain longer. Shadows were used strategically, cast by bodies or cloth to protect the pit from direct sun. This method did not guarantee survival. It extended the possibility. Digging for underground water did not solve thirst. It interrupted it briefly. Yet that interruption could mean the difference between continuing and collapsing, where no one would find the body. Outsiders often imagined dramatic moments of discovery, water bursting upward in relief. The reality was quieter. A slow darkening of sand, a damp cloth, a few careful swallows. Survival here had no triumph, only continuation. The practice reflected a deeper relationship with the land. People did not expect the desert to provide generously. They asked only for what it could spare. They understood that taking too much destroyed the source. Moderation was not a moral choice. It was a necessity. Over generations, this knowledge persisted. It was taught through action rather than explanation. Children watched. They remembered where adults stopped digging, where they shook their heads and moved on. These memories guided future attempts long after words were forgotten. Digging with bare hands demanded humility. It placed the body directly against the land, exposed to heat, strain, and uncertainty. There was no distance between survival and failure. The sand responded only to patience. Survival sometimes depended on pulling moisture slowly from the ground, rather than searching for visible water. That effort required restraint, timing, and the willingness to stop before danger replaced hope. There were places where water gathered naturally, without digging, if one knew where to look. An oasis in the Sahara was never simply a place where water appeared. It was a fragile interruption in a landscape built to deny life. From afar, it suggested relief, even mercy. From within, it revealed its true nature as a space that demanded discipline, restraint, and constant awareness. People did not arrive at an oasis to relax. They arrived to survive a little longer. The water that sustained an oasis usually came from deep underground, rising slowly through hidden channels shaped by time rather than design. It was ancient water, stored long before the present climate hardened into extremes. Once drawn to the surface, it did not replenish easily. Every bucket removed mattered. Those who lived beside an oasis understood this instinctively. Water was never assumed to be renewable. It was treated as something that could be exhausted at any moment. Life formed tightly around this source. Homes were built close, often clustered, reducing the need for movement and waste. Fields were small and shaded, planted only with what the water could support. Animals were limited in number and brought to drink according to strict routines. Nothing here was accidental. Every decision was filtered through the same concern. Would this shorten the life of the water? Control of an oasis was rarely chaotic. In many communities, responsibility fell to a tribal elder or leader whose authority came from memory rather than force. This person did not own the water. They guarded its balance. Their role was to remember past shortages, past failures, and past losses, and to prevent them from happening again. Decisions were often final, not because they were unquestionable, but because hesitation could be fatal. Rules governed access quietly. Water was drawn at specific times. Irrigation followed fixed rotations. Certain uses were forbidden during dry seasons. These laws were not written or announced publicly. They were learned through observation and correction. A person who took too much would not be punished harshly at first. They would be reminded. Repeated mistakes were taken seriously because repetition threatened everyone. Fairness at an oasis was not an ideal. It was a survival mechanism. Unequal access bred resentment. Resentment encouraged secrecy. Secrecy led to hoarding. Hoarding led to collapse. Communities learned this through loss, and once learned, they did not forget it easily. Water was shared because not sharing ended life. Travelers arriving at an oasis were offered water, but always within limits. Hospitality existed, but it was careful. Guests were welcomed, rested briefly, and then encouraged to move on. Staying too long risked burdening the source. This boundary was understood by both host and visitor. Gratitude replaced entitlement. Survival depended on it. Children grew up surrounded by these habits. From a young age, they learned when to drink and when to wait. They learned that spilling water was not a small mistake. It was corrected immediately, without anger, but without softness. The lesson was not about obedience. It was about consequence. Forgetting scarcity, even for a moment, could shorten everyone's future. Despite careful management, oases were never permanent. Underground flows shifted. Overuse weakened sources. Years of low rainfall took their toll. Communities sometimes watched their water diminish slowly, season by season. At first, adjustments were made. Use was reduced. Crops were abandoned. Animals were sold or moved away. Eventually, the decision to leave became unavoidable. Leaving an oasis was never sudden. It unfolded over months or years. People packed slowly, dismantled homes, and marked the place in memory rather than stone. The departure carried grief, not only for the land, but for the shared life it had sustained. An oasis was not just water, it was history concentrated into a single point. Outsiders often imagined oases as lush, generous spaces filled with greenery and ease. In reality, beauty existed only through control. Shade was limited. Plants were pruned relentlessly. Excess growth was removed before it drained the source. Comfort was restrained by design. Nothing here was allowed to expand freely. Water also attracted danger. Raiders and rival groups understood the value of an oasis. Control over one could determine movement across wide regions of the desert. For this reason, communities often avoided drawing attention to their water. Activity was kept quiet. Defenses were subtle. The safest oasis was often the one no one spoke about. Silence became a form of protection. Loud gatherings near water were discouraged. Animals were kept calm. Noise carried far in the desert, and attention was rarely welcome. The oasis survived best when it blended into the landscape, appearing unremarkable to those passing by. What defined an oasis was not abundance, but balance. It did not exist to defeat the desert. It existed within it, surviving only by respecting its limits. People learned to take only what they needed, leaving the rest untouched. This restraint allowed life to persist in a place designed to erase it. When an oasis finally failed, the desert reclaimed it quickly. Plants dried, shade vanished, channels filled with sand. Within a short time, nothing remained to show that life had once gathered there. Without memory, the place became indistinguishable from the surrounding land. The Sahara erased evidence without effort. Yet the idea of the oasis endured. Even after leaving, people remembered where water had once sustained them. These memories guided future movement, even when the land had changed. The desert shifted, but habits of caution survived. An oasis was never a solution. It was a pause, a narrow allowance granted by the land, conditional and temporary. Those who understood this lived longer. Those who forgot it did not. These places allowed life to gather only as long as restraint and balance were preserved. Once that balance broke, the desert erased every trace without hesitation. Beyond these fragile shelters, survival depended on carrying water rather than waiting for it. Carrying water across the Sahara meant accepting that water could not be waited for. It had to move with the body. Long journeys between wells, oases, and seasonal sources demanded a way to hold moisture without losing it to heat and air. Containers mattered as much as the water itself. The wrong vessel could turn survival into failure long before the desert was crossed. Animal skin became the answer through experience rather than invention. Goats and sheep were already central to life in the desert, valued for meat, milk, and mobility. Their skins, once cleaned and prepared, offered something rare: flexibility combined with resistance. Unlike clay or wood, leather did not crack easily under heat or movement. Unlike metal, it did not conduct heat quickly. It adapted to the desert rather than fighting it. The process of preparing a water skin was deliberate. Hides were scraped carefully, treated with fats, and dried in shade rather than direct sun. The natural oils left in the leather served a purpose. They slowed evaporation, sealing moisture inside without making the container rigid. Over time, the skin softened, shaped by use and the body that carried it. Each bag became unique, responding to its owner's movement and habits. These skins were never filled. Space was left inside to prevent strain and splitting. A partially filled bag moved more quietly, sloshing less and drawing less attention. It also allowed the leather to flex, reducing stress at the seams. Small decisions like this extended the life of the container and the water within it. Water carried in animal skin did not taste clean by modern standards. The leather imparted an earthy, sometimes oily flavor. Over time, residue built up. But taste was secondary. What mattered was retention. The skin protected water from direct sun and wind, two forces that stripped moisture relentlessly from any exposed surface. Even after hours of travel, water inside a skin remained usable when water carried openly would not. Evaporation was the enemy. In the Sahara, even sealed containers lose moisture if poorly designed. Animal skins resisted this loss better than most alternatives available at the time. The oils within the leather slowed the escape of water vapor, creating a barrier that functioned quietly and reliably. This difference mattered over long distances. A small reduction in loss each day accumulated into survival. Carrying water also required understanding weight. Water is heavy, and every added load increases exhaustion. People learned to calculate carefully. Carrying too much slowed progress and increased sweating. Carrying too little risked collapse. Animal skins helped balance this equation by allowing water to be distributed across the body. Bags were slung over shoulders, tied to saddles, or balanced against movement to reduce strain. The relationship between the water carrier and the traveler was intimate. A skin bag was checked constantly. Leaks were repaired quickly. Seams were inspected at every stop. A damaged bag could not be replaced easily in the open desert. Losing a container often meant losing the journey. People treated these skins with the same care given to weapons or animals. Movement changed when water was carried. Travel became measured, steady, and deliberate. Sudden changes in pace caused spills and stress on containers. Rest stops were planned around the condition of the water skins as much as the body. Shade was used not only to protect people, but to protect the water they carried. These skins allowed journeys of hundreds of kilometers, linking distant points of survival across otherwise deadly terrain. Trade routes depended on them. Migration depended on them. Without portable water, the Sahara would have remained fragmented into isolated pockets of life. Animal skin containers stitched those pockets together. The practice also enforced discipline. Knowing that water was limited and visible made consumption deliberate. Every sip was measured. Drinking directly from a skin discouraged waste. There was no illusion of abundance. The weight of the bag reminded the carrier of what remained. Animals benefited as well. Water skins could be shared with livestock during critical moments, extending the range of herds. This flexibility mattered during unexpected delays or route changes. A container that served both humans and animals increased the odds for both. Maintenance was constant. Skins were cleaned when possible, dried carefully, and re-oiled to restore resistance. Neglect shortened their life. A cracked skin meant loss, not inconvenience. Knowledge of care was passed quietly, through observation rather than instruction. Children learned by watching adults handle these containers with respect. Modern containers may appear superior, but they solve different problems. Animal skins were not designed for convenience. They were designed for endurance. They accepted heat, movement, and abrasion without complaint. They were forgiving of mistakes, surviving conditions that shattered rigid vessels. Carrying water did not make the desert safe. It made it navigable. The Sahara still demanded judgment, restraint, and timing. A water skin extended possibility, not certainty. People still died with water on their backs because they misjudged distance or weather. The container could not correct poor decisions. It could only support the careful ones. What these skins represent is adaptation without excess. They were made from what was already present, using processes refined over generations. No part of the animal was wasted. Survival tools emerged from necessity rather than innovation. In this way, animal skin water carriers became symbols of movement itself. They embodied the idea that life in the Sahara depended on carrying one's chances forward, rather than waiting for relief. Water had to travel, just as people did. These containers allowed water to move with the body, turning distance into something survivable rather than fatal. Their quiet efficiency depended on care, restraint, and constant attention. In some moments, moisture was taken directly from living plants, without carrying anything at all. Moisture was not always carried or dug for. Sometimes it was taken directly from living things, drawn slowly and reluctantly from plants that survived where nothing else could. This method was never preferred. It was chosen only when movement became dangerous and waiting offered no relief. In the Sahara, even plants lived on the edge of failure, and taking from them required care. Certain roots held moisture deep within their cores. These were not obvious to an untrained eye. The surface appeared dry and lifeless, but beneath it, fibers carried faint traces of water drawn from underground. People learned to recognize which plants were worth disturbing and which were not. Cutting the wrong root wasted energy and destroyed a future guide. Knowledge here mattered more than strength. Roots were exposed carefully, often by hand, sometimes with a small blade. Only a portion was taken. Tearing too much risks killing the plant and losing any chance of moisture later. The exposed core was chewed slowly, not swallowed quickly. The goal was extraction, not consumption. Fibers were spat out after the liquid was drawn. Swallowing them offered little benefit and increased discomfort. Cactus was approached with even more caution. Popular imagination treats the cactus as a reliable source of water. In reality, most species are dangerous. Many contain compounds that irritate the stomach or poison the body. Only specific types were used, and even then, reluctantly. People who survived learned this distinction through loss, not instruction. Soft cactus flesh was cut into small pieces, avoiding the skin and spines. The pulp was chewed gently, releasing moisture trapped within. The taste was bitter, sometimes burning. Swallowing was limited. The liquid soothed the mouth briefly, but often punished the body later. Diarrhea was common. Weakness followed. But in moments of severe dehydration, even temporary relief mattered. This method was not about hydration in a lasting sense. It was about easing the body long enough to prevent collapse. Moisture from plants did not replace water loss fully. It slowed the decline. It reduced the shock that sudden thirst imposed on the body. It bought hours, sometimes a day. In the desert, time mattered. People understood the trade. Relief now meant suffering later. Digestive distress weakened the body further, but dehydration killed faster. Choosing plant moisture meant choosing a slower, less certain danger over immediate failure. Decisions were not framed as right or wrong. They were weighed quietly against the alternatives. Children were rarely encouraged to do this, unless no other option remained. Their bodies reacted more violently. Adults often endured the discomfort themselves to spare the young. The act was unpleasant to watch. Faces tightened, movements slowed. There was no satisfaction in it, only necessity. The danger lay not only in toxins but in false confidence. Moisture from plants could trick the mind into movement. Feeling relief tempted people to walk further, to push onward. This was often fatal. Those who survived learned to remain still after taking plant moisture, allowing the body to use what it could without increasing loss through exertion. Knowledge of which plants to use was guarded carefully. It was shared within families and small groups, not widely broadcast. Outsiders often misuse it, cutting the wrong species or taking too much. Stories circulated of travelers who trusted cactus blindly and never recovered. The desert did not correct mistakes gently. Even roots and cacti that were safe one season might not be the next. Environmental changes altered chemical balances. Drought intensified toxins. What worked before could fail later. This uncertainty reinforced caution. No plant was ever trusted fully. The act of drawing moisture from plants also carried emotional weight. It marked a crossing point. People remembered the first time they had to do it. It meant that reserves were gone, roots misjudged, or conditions were worse than expected. Survival entered a narrower corridor. Every action afterward was scrutinized. This method revealed how survival knowledge was layered. Plant moisture was never the first response. It followed observation, digging, waiting, and carrying. Only when these failed did people turn to living sources. Each layer stripped away comfort, leaving only function. Modern interpretations often romanticize this practice as a clever adaptation. Those who lived it knew better. It was uncomfortable, risky, and unreliable. It kept people alive not by sustaining them, but by preventing immediate collapse. That distinction mattered. Plants that survived in the Sahara did so by conserving aggressively. Taking from them was a negotiation. Too much, and both plant and person suffered. Too little, and the effort was wasted. Balance was learned slowly, through repeated exposure and memory. Afterward, the body bore the cost. Weakness lingered. Digestion remained unstable. Recovery required clean water eventually. Plant moisture was never an endpoint. It was a bridge, fragile and temporary. Despite its risks, this method remained part of survival knowledge because it often worked well enough. Enough people lived through it to pass the memory on. Enough survived to warn others of its limits. The desert allowed no perfect solutions, only partial ones. What defined this practice was restraint. Chewing slowly, spitting fibers, resting afterward, stopping before damage outweighs the benefit. Those who ignored these boundaries paid quickly. In the Sahara, survival rarely came from a single action. It emerged from combining small, uncomfortable choices, each reducing loss just enough to continue. Drawing moisture from plants was one of those choices, used sparingly and remembered carefully. Moisture taken from plants slowed the collapse, but carried its own quiet dangers. It was chosen only when movement became more threatening than waiting. Some survival depended not on what was taken, but on when to stop taking it. Night in the Sahara changed the rules without softening them. When the sun fell away, heat retreated quickly, and the air shifted. The land that had burned all day began to cool, and in that cooling, something rare happened. Moisture, invisible during daylight, started to gather. It did not arrive as rain. It did not announce itself. It formed quietly, one breath at a time. Dew was never abundant. It appeared thin and fragile, clinging to surfaces that allowed it to settle. People learned to wait for it without expectation. They did not chase it. They prepared for it. Cloth was laid out before night fully arrived, spread across low ground or draped over frames. Leaves were gathered and arranged to catch what the air would release. Nothing about this process was hurried. Fabric mattered. Rough cloth held moisture better than smooth surfaces. Worn garments, already softened by use, absorbed more than new ones. People chose materials carefully, knowing that the difference between success and failure could be measured in drops. Leaves with wide surfaces were favored, especially those that cooled quickly after sunset. They became quiet collectors, holding what the air could spare. Shelter played a role. Low tents were set deliberately, close to the ground, trapping cooler air beneath them. As warm breath and body heat rose, moisture condensed along the inner surfaces. By morning, faint beads formed where none had existed hours before. These were not dramatic pools. They were traces, gathered patiently. The act of collecting dew demanded restraint. Cloth was not shaken or wrung immediately. Movement scattered moisture. Instead, fabric was folded carefully, pressed gently into containers or mouths. Every action was slow. Rushing wasted effort. Waste here felt heavier than hunger. What made this method difficult was time. An entire night might yield only a few mouthfuls, sometimes less. People lay awake listening to the wind, resisting the urge to move, knowing that stillness preserved what little was forming. Sleep came lightly. Thirst sharpened awareness. Morning arrived without relief, the only possibility. The desert did not reward effort equally. Some nights produced more dew than others. Wind stripped moisture away. Warm nights yielded almost nothing. Cooler evenings offered slightly more. Those who survived learned to sense these conditions, adjusting expectations quietly. Disappointment was common. Panic was avoided. This practice rarely stood alone. It worked best when paired with stillness and shade. Dew collection allowed people to avoid moving at dawn. When the sun returned quickly, a few sips taken before daylight reduced urgency. Reduced urgency prevented reckless movement. That prevention mattered more than the water itself. Children learned this patience early. They were taught to watch cloth at first light, to recognize the difference between dampness and dryness. Spilling was corrected gently but firmly. A dropped cloth meant lost hours. These lessons were learned without explanation. The desert explained the consequences clearly enough. The amount collected was often humiliatingly small. Half a cup after an entire night was considered success. Less was common. People did not complain. Complaints wasted breath and moisture. They accepted what was gathered and adjusted plans accordingly. Survival became a sequence of modest gains rather than dramatic rescues. Dew water tasted neutral, sometimes faintly metallic from contact with cloth or leaves. It felt cool on the tongue, easing the dryness left by heat and dust. The body responded immediately, even to small amounts. Thirst did not vanish, but it softened. That softening allowed clearer thought. This method carried fewer risks than others, but it was not harmless. Spending the night awake drained energy. Cold temperatures weakened the body. Cloth left out too long could freeze moisture into uselessness. People balanced these risks constantly, choosing nights carefully. Not every evening was worth the effort. Modern observers often dismiss dew collection as ineffective. They measure success by volume rather than impact. Those who depended on it understood its purpose differently. Dew did not sustain life. It interrupted the decline. It gave the body enough to wait, to observe, to choose better timing. The practice also reinforced humility. Dew was never guaranteed. It could not be forced or accelerated. People prepared, then waited. This waiting shaped behavior deeply. It discouraged haste. It rewarded attention. It punished expectation. In a land where impatience killed, this mattered. The tools involved were simple, but their use was not. Placement mattered, height mattered, orientation to wind mattered. Cloth laid flat behaved differently from cloth hung loosely. These details were learned slowly, through repetition rather than instruction. Knowledge grew quiet and personal. Dew collection also influenced movement patterns. Groups adjusted travel to coincide with nights that favored condensation. Routes were planned around cooler elevations or areas that retained nighttime humidity. This subtle planning reduced reliance on digging or dangerous sources. It was less dramatic but safer. Morning rituals formed around this practice. Cloth was checked, folded, and stored before the sun rose fully. Any remaining moisture was consumed immediately. Containers were dried and prepared again. The cycle repeated whenever conditions allowed. Nothing here was wasted. The desert tolerated this method because it asked little. It took what the air released naturally, without tearing at the land. This restraint aligned with survival elsewhere in the Sahara. What endured was what respected limits. Dew did not save lives on its own. It supported the moments between danger and decision. It allowed people to pause without collapsing. In those pauses, better choices became possible. The value lay not in the water, but in the time it created. Those who relied on dew remembered the nights more vividly than the days. Darkness brought effort rather than rest. Yet those efforts were quieter, safer, and less costly than daytime struggle. The desert felt less hostile at night, even as it offered little. In the end, dew collection represented acceptance. Acceptance that survival might be measured in drops. Acceptance that waiting could be more powerful than moving. Acceptance that endurance often came from stillness rather than action. This method turned long nights into small chances rather than empty hours. Its value lay in patience and restraint rather than quantity. Other sources of water depended on movement, following living trails rather than stillness. Cooling the body in the Sahara was not about comfort. It was about a slow loss. Heat itself did not kill as quickly as dehydration did, and every strategy focused on keeping moisture inside the body for as long as possible. People learned that the most dangerous habit was movement under the sun. Activity during daylight burned water invisibly, pulling it out through sweat and breath until collapse arrived quietly. The first rule was avoidance. Travel during the hottest hours was minimized or abandoned entirely. When movement was unavoidable, it was brief and deliberate. Most journeys began before sunrise or after dusk, when the air released its grip. Midday was reserved for stillness. Shade was sought wherever it existed, even if it was narrow and temporary. A rock, a shallow depression, a folded cloth stretched overhead, anything that interrupted direct sunlight was used. Staying still felt unnatural to those unfamiliar with the desert. Instinct pushed people to keep moving, to search actively for relief. Experience taught the opposite. Motion multiplied loss. The body heated faster, breathed harder, and released moisture that could not be replaced. Those who survived longest learned to wait without panic. Waiting preserved life more reliably than searching. Clothing became a tool rather than a decoration. Light-colored fabrics reflected heat instead of absorbing it. Thin cloth allowed air to pass while shielding skin from direct sun. Covering the body reduced sweating by limiting exposure, even though it appeared counterintuitive. Bare skin felt cooler briefly, but it dried faster. Covered skin retained moisture longer. The way cloth was worn mattered. Loose layers created pockets of air that slowed heat transfer. Tight garments trapped heat and increased discomfort. People adjusted their clothing constantly, opening it slightly in the shade, tightening it in the sun. These small adjustments reduced loss over hours rather than minutes. Head coverings were essential. The scalp released heat rapidly, and direct sunlight there drained energy quickly. Wrapping the head protected not only skin but judgment. Heat impaired thinking long before physical collapse became obvious. A covered head preserved clarity, allowing better decisions when they mattered most. Breathing was controlled deliberately. Rapid breathing expelled moisture invisibly. People trained themselves to breathe slowly and shallowly, especially during exertion. Talking was limited. Conversation wasted water without providing a benefit. Silence was practical. It conserved moisture and focus at the same time. Even posture mattered. Standing exposes more surface area to the sun and wind. Sitting or lying down reduced it. People positioned themselves to minimize contact with hot ground, using cloth or packs as insulation. These choices felt small, but over hours they accumulated into survival. Cooling strategies extended beyond the body itself. Shade structures were built low to trap cooler air. The ground beneath was sometimes dampened slightly if moisture existed, lowering the temperature further. The goal was not to create comfort, but to reduce the gradient that pulled water out of the body. The desert punished impatience. Those who ignored heat to push forward often paid later when shade was gone and reserves exhausted. Survivors spoke of moments when stopping felt like surrender, but continuing would have been fatal. Recognizing those moments was a learned skill. Children were taught restraint early. They learned not to run, not to shout, not to waste energy. The play was brief and controlled. Excess movement was corrected quietly. The lesson was not harsh. It was realism. The desert did not allow waste. Cooling the body also meant cooling decisions. Panic, increased heat through tension and rapid movement. Calm slowed everything. People learned to respond rather than react. This emotional discipline reduced physical loss as much as any cloth or shelter. Night offered relief, but daytime strategies determined whether night could be reached at all. Those who managed heat well arrived at dusk with strength intact. Those who did not often collapsed hours earlier, when assistance was least likely. The effectiveness of these methods was not dramatic. No one felt suddenly safe or refreshed. The change was subtle: slower decline, steadier thought, fewer mistakes. In the Sahara, these differences mattered more than strength or speed. Modern observers often underestimate these techniques because they appear passive, avoiding movement, staying silent, covering the body. These look like doing nothing. In reality, they required discipline and awareness. Doing nothing at the right time demanded control. The body responded to these practices gradually. Heart rate steadied, thirst sharpened less quickly, urine remained lighter longer. These signs guided behavior. People adjusted based on feedback, not hope. Cooling the body did not eliminate danger. It narrowed it. It bought time to dig, to wait for dew, to reach shade, to choose better routes. Survival was assembled from these margins. In the end, managing heat was about respect. Respect for limits that could not be negotiated. The desert allowed survival only when demands were reduced. Those who learned to reduce them lived longer. What stands out is how unremarkable these actions were. No special tools were required. No technology intervened. Survival depended on attention, restraint, and timing. The body was treated as a vessel to be preserved, not a machine to be driven. Cooling was continuous, not a single act. It shaped every hour of the day. It influenced when people moved, spoke, ate, and rested. It became a habit rather than a strategy. When these habits failed, other methods became necessary, often harsher and riskier. Cooling the body was the first line of defense, quietly preventing the need for desperate choices later. Managing heat slowed the loss that made every other method necessary. Restraint during the day preserved strength for decisions that could not wait. Animals on the move revealed paths toward moisture that stillness could not provide. Animals in the Sahara rarely moved without reason. Every step cost them water and energy, just as it did humans. Unlike people, however, they did not guess. They followed patterns shaped by instinct and repetition. Those who survived learned that watching animals was often safer than trusting memory or hope. Tracks in the sand told quiet stories. Hoofprints that moved with purpose rather than wandering suggested direction. Antelopes and gazelles were especially important. These animals could travel long distances, but they still depended on water regularly. Their paths rarely ended in nothing. Following them did not guarantee success, but it reduced uncertainty. In the desert, reducing uncertainty mattered more than speed. The timing of these tracks mattered as much as their presence. Fresh prints held sharp edges. Older ones softened quickly under wind and heat. People learned to read by depth and clarity. A trail made in the early morning carried more promise than one left days before. Time decided whether following was worth the effort. Predators were watched differently. Desert foxes and other carnivores traveled lighter and more frequently. They drank smaller amounts but did so often. Their routes were shorter, looping between known sources. Observing their movement required patience. They did not move in straight lines. They circled, returned, and disappeared. Learning when to follow and when to wait separated survival from exhaustion. Droppings offered another signal, though few spoke of it openly. Animal waste dried quickly in the Sahara, Moist droppings suggested recent feeding and hydration. That meant water nearby. The distance varied, but it narrowed the search. People examined texture, not just appearance. Shine mattered, cracks mattered, even smell carried information. These details were unpleasant, but ignored at one's own risk. Birds provided signs from above. Small birds rarely strayed far from water, especially in the heat. Their flight patterns were watched carefully. Birds moving directly and repeatedly toward the same point suggested a destination. Circling behavior mattered too. Birds wheeling low over one area often indicated moisture, shade, or insects drawn to water. Large birds resting during the hottest hours were also noted. They conserved energy near resources, not far from them. Seeing such birds on the ground, rather than in flight, narrowed possibilities. Watching costs nothing. Chasing blindly costs lives. This method required restraint. Following animals too closely disturbed them. Startled animals scattered, breaking the trail. People learned to keep a distance, to observe without interfering. Survival depended on patience rather than pursuit. Animals did not lead directly to wells or pools. Often, they led to places where digging was possible, or where dew collected more reliably, or where underground moisture fed plants. The trail pointed toward opportunity, not certainty. Those who expected immediate reward often pushed too far and lost what advantage they had gained. Not all signs were trustworthy. Some animals traveled at night and rested far from water during the day. Others moved after feeding, not before drinking. Experience taught which signs mattered in which conditions. Knowledge here was layered, built from correction rather than success. Children learned this skill slowly. They were taught to watch rather than ask. Adults did not explain every choice. They followed tracks quietly, stopping without announcement. Children learned by copying, by noticing when direction changed without discussion. Silence preserved focus. The danger lay in overconfidence. Animal signs reduced the risk but did not remove it. A trail could end on dry ground. Droppings could mislead. Birds could circle for reasons unrelated to water. Those who treated these signs as guarantees often failed. Survivors treated them as hints, nothing more. Using animals as guides also meant accepting competition. If animals drank there, so might predators or other groups. Arriving late could mean finding nothing. Arriving too early could mean danger. Timing again mattered more than strength. What made this method powerful was its efficiency. Instead of searching randomly, people aligned themselves with life, already navigating the desert successfully. They borrowed instinct rather than inventing direction. This reduced wasted movement, which preserved water inside the body. Modern travelers often rely on maps and instruments. Animals rely on memory and need. In the Sahara, need is often the more accurate guide. Instruments show what once existed. Animals respond to what exists now. Following animal signs also shaped humility. Humans were not masters of the land here. They were observers. Survival meant admitting that other creatures understood the desert better. Pride had no place in this exchange. This practice blended with others. Tracks led to digging sites. Birds indicated areas where dew formed more heavily. Droppings narrowed search zones. No single sign stood alone. Survival emerged from combining them carefully. When signs failed, despair followed quickly. The absolute absence of animal movement suggested danger. Areas where nothing passed through were often lifeless for a reason. People learned to retreat from such places before exhaustion trapped them. Over time, these observations became instinctive. People felt unease without knowing why. They turned back without explanation. Later they learned that no tracks crossed that ground. No birds flew there, and no insects moved. The desert had warned them quietly. What remains striking is how ordinary this knowledge became. It was not dramatic. It was repeated daily, adjusted constantly, and rarely celebrated. Those who survived did so because they noticed what others overlooked. In the Sahara, water did not always reveal itself directly. It announced itself through movement, behavior, and absence. Animals carried that information unknowingly. Humans learned to listen. Watching animals reduced uncertainty in a land where guessing often meant death. These signs worked only when combined with patience and restraint. Some water was carried not by movement, but hidden inside food that traveled well. Food in the Sahara was never only food. It was also storage, carried quietly in cloth or leather, measured not by fullness, but by what it could preserve inside the body. When water could not be found or carried in sufficient amounts, people turned to what they could eat that released moisture slowly rather than all at once. This was not indulgence. It was a calculation. Dates were among the most valued supplies for this reason. They survived heat without spoiling, packed easily, and offered more than sweetness. Beneath their dense flesh lay small amounts of moisture, bound tightly within fiber and sugar. Eaten carefully, dates release water gradually, preventing sudden loss through sweat. They did not quench thirst. They softened it. Wild melons and gourds played a similar role when available. Their water content was higher, but they were fragile and seasonal. Carrying them required care. Bruising wasted moisture. Exposure to the unshortened usefulness. When found fresh, they were eaten slowly, shared deliberately, and never consumed in excess. Overeating led to digestive distress, which turned a benefit into a loss. The method mattered as much as the food itself. Chewing was done slowly, sometimes for far longer than comfort suggested. The goal was extraction, not speed. Saliva mixed with pulp, releasing moisture that could be absorbed before swallowing. This reduced strain on digestion and prevented the body from reacting too quickly. Rushing wasted water invisibly, as the body expelled what it could not manage. People learned to stop before satisfaction. Finishing a portion felt tempting, especially when hunger and thirst blurred together. Experience taught restraint. Eating too much increases metabolic heat and thirst later. Small amounts, spaced carefully, extended endurance. Survival here depended on stopping early rather than finishing strong. Food rich in moisture also reduced the need to drink. Each mouthful replaced a sip that might not be available. Over days, this substitution mattered. It allowed carried water to last longer, preserved reserves for emergencies, and reduced panic. Panic burned water faster than hunger ever could. These foods traveled well. Dates could be packed tightly, protected from insects and heat. Their weight justified itself over long distances. They provided energy without forcing immediate hydration. This balance supported steady movement at night and stillness by day. The body functioned without demanding more than could be given. Children were taught these habits early. They learned to chew slowly, to pause between bites, to recognize the difference between hunger and thirst. Treating food as water storage required discipline. Spilling juice or discarding pulp was corrected quietly. Waste shortened journeys. This practice also influenced meal timing. Eating during the heat increased thirst. Meals were shifted to cooler hours, when the body could process moisture with less loss. Night eating became common. The desert rewarded those who aligned intake with temperature rather than appetite. Food choices were conservative. Anything that increased thirst was avoided. Salty or heavily dried foods were limited or excluded entirely. Preservation methods favored balance over longevity. Food that lasted longer but demanded water later was dangerous. What mattered was not how long food survived, but how gently it treated the body. The body responded gradually. Urine remained lighter. Mouth dryness eased without sudden spikes. Strength persisted longer between rest periods. These changes were subtle but meaningful. People adjusted their behavior based on these signs, not on schedules or plans. Modern thinking often separates nutrition and hydration. In the Sahara, they merged. Food that failed to support hydration was a liability. Hunger could be tolerated, thirst could not. This hierarchy shaped everything people carried. Wild fruits were treated with caution. Not all moisture-rich plants were safe. Some caused sickness or diarrhea, which reversed gains quickly. Knowledge of which fruits could be trusted was passed carefully. Mistakes were remembered vividly. One error could undo days of careful management. Sharing followed strict patterns. Moist foods were divided evenly, often by count rather than weight. Each person received the same number of dates or pieces. Fairness preserved trust. Trust preserved cooperation. Cooperation preserved life. The emotional effect of this method was significant. Eating provided relief without panic. It offered a routine when water searches failed. That routine stabilized decision-making. People thought more clearly when hunger and thirst were controlled quietly rather than fought dramatically. Food, as water storage, also supported long waiting periods. When movement stopped to collect dew or avoid heat, small portions sustained the body without increasing thirst. This compatibility mattered. Methods that worked against each other failed quickly. Dates and stillness worked together. Nothing about this practice was romantic. It was repetitive, restrained, and uncelebrated. People did not speak of cleverness. They spoke of what lasted. What lasted was remembered. What failed was abandoned. The success of this approach depended on honesty with oneself. Eating more felt better briefly, then worse later. Those who learned to endure mild discomfort avoided severe collapse. The desert rewarded patience over satisfaction. Over generations, this understanding became a habit. People reached for certain foods instinctively, without explanation. They packed them before journeys without discussion. Knowledge settled into routine, where it was safest. Food did not replace water. It reduced the urgency that led to mistakes. It bought time for better options to appear. In the Sahara, time was the most valuable resource of all. When moisture-rich food ran out, decisions hardened. Other methods carried a greater risk. People prepared mentally for those transitions, knowing that each layer of survival stripped away comfort. Food was among the gentlest layers, used early and carefully. What remains striking is how small the margins were. A few dates, eaten slowly, could extend a journey by hours or days. Those hours could reach shade, dew, or digging ground. Survival hinged on these quiet calculations. Moist foods softened thirst, without forcing the body into rapid loss. Their value came from restraint, timing, and careful chewing rather than volume. In extreme moments, the body itself became a source to be weighed against danger. The decision to take water from a dead animal marked a point where survival stripped itself of dignity. It was not planned, taught openly, or spoken of with pride. It emerged only when all other methods had failed, and the body stood at the edge of collapse. In the Sahara, death often arrived quietly. This choice was made to delay it, not to defeat it. Camels were central to desert life precisely because they carried water inside themselves. Their bodies stored fluid in ways no human could. Even after death, that capacity did not vanish immediately. The stomach chambers and large intestines could still contain liquid, thick and warm, but usable. People who understood this did not see a carcass as only a loss. They saw it as a possibility. Approaching a dead camel was never easy. The body bloated quickly under the sun. The smell was overwhelming. Flies gathered almost immediately. Touching it felt wrong, even to those hardened by desert life. But hesitation wasted time, and time was already gone. Those who survived learned to move past instinctive revulsion without rushing into panic. The process was crude and physical. Skin was torn open by hand or blade. The belly was breached carefully, not out of respect, but necessity. Piercing too deeply risked releasing gases that could overwhelm or disorient. Experience taught restraint even here. Survival demanded control even in the most desperate acts. Liquid was taken from the stomach chambers, where digestion held moisture longer. This was not clean water. It was mixed with partially digested plant matter, thick and sour. People did not drink deeply. They took small amounts, swallowed slowly, and waited. Vomiting meant failure. Loss could not be recovered. The intestines offered additional fluid, sometimes clearer, sometimes worse. Each body differed, depending on how recently the animal had drunk and what it had eaten. No two situations were the same. Those who survived did not assume consistency. They adjusted quietly, responding to what the body allowed. This method carried a serious risk. Bacteria thrived in decomposing flesh. Infection followed easily. Many who survived dehydration later fell ill. Some never recovered fully, but illness came slower than thirst. That difference mattered. The choice was not between safety and danger. It was between danger now and death sooner. People rarely attempted this alone. If others were present, the decision was shared without discussion. Roles emerged naturally. One opened the body, another prepared cloth, another watched for predators. Even in desperation, cooperation persisted. Isolation increased the risk too sharply. Children were shielded when possible. Adults endured the act themselves, passing fluid to the young in small amounts. This transfer carried emotional weight. Survival became collective rather than individual. No one spoke of fairness. They acted according to necessity. The mental strain of this act lingered long after. Survivors remembered the taste, the smell, the moment of decision more vividly than the relief. It marked a crossing point. After this, the desert felt closer, more intimate, less forgiving. People carried that memory quietly. Outsiders often imagine this act as savagery. Those who lived it understood it differently. It was not violence. It was reused. The camel had died, often from the same conditions threatening humans. Taking what remained was not cruelty. It was a continuation. This practice was never romanticized within desert cultures. It was mentioned rarely, often indirectly. Stories warned, rather than celebrated. They reminded listeners that routes must be judged carefully, water measured strictly, and animals protected whenever possible. A dead camel represented failure as much as survival. Even after drinking, movement remained limited. The body needed rest to absorb what it could. Exertion increases the risk of vomiting and infection. Survivors stayed still, shaded, silent. They waited to see if the body would accept the gift or reject it. The desert offered no reassurance. Drinking from a carcass did not guarantee survival. Many died afterward anyway. But enough lived for the knowledge to persist. Enough delay, death long enough to reach water or shelter. That narrow margin justified remembering. Modern sensibilities recoil from this image. That reaction itself reveals distance from scarcity. In the Sahara, moral categories shifted under pressure. What mattered was not what felt acceptable, but what preserved life for another hour or day. The body changed after such moments. Appetite faded, sensitivity increased, smell lingered in memory. Survivors often avoided meat for long periods afterward. Recovery was slow, uneven, and incomplete. Survival left marks. This method existed at the edge of survival knowledge, used only when all gentler layers were gone. It followed dew, digging, carrying, restraint, and waiting. Each layer removed comfort. This one removed the illusion. What defined it was not courage, but surrender to necessity. No one chose this path willingly. It appeared only when the desert forced the choice. Survival here was not heroic. It was grim and exacting. The camel, long a symbol of endurance, became a final reservoir when endurance failed. Life moved from one body to another without ceremony. The desert accepted this exchange without comment. Those who lived through it did not speak loudly afterward. They returned to quieter methods whenever possible. They protected animals more carefully. They measured water with greater respect. Memory sharpened discipline. In the Sahara, survival was never about purity. It was about the sequence. Each option existed to delay the next, harsher one. Taking water from a dead animal sat near the end of that sequence. At this point, survival depended on accepting what felt unbearable rather than surrendering. The desert allowed life to continue, but only by removing every illusion of choice. After this, water was no longer sought only outside the body. Water, when it became scarce, stopped being a personal possession. In the Sahara, it turned into a shared responsibility measured against survival rather than fairness as comfort. Decisions about who drank and when were not guided by emotion. They were guided by consequence. Every sip taken by one body affected the chances of another. Children were almost always given priority. Their bodies lost water faster, and recovery came slower. A dehydrated child could not endure delay. Elders understood this without debate. Even when adults suffered visibly, they waited. The desert taught that preserving the young preserved the future. Without children, survival beyond the present moment lost meaning. The elderly were also considered carefully. Their bodies tolerated dehydration poorly, and weakness arrived early. Yet this priority was not automatic. In some situations, elders insisted on restraint, choosing to endure longer so younger members could drink. These decisions were not dramatic. They were quiet and final. No one argued, because arguing wasted energy. Different communities used different systems to manage distribution. Some measured water by time. A container was passed, and each person drank until a set count ended. Others used stones or markers placed beside a vessel. One stone removed meant one portion taken. When the stones were gone, so was the water. This method reduced conflict. The system, not the individual, enforced limits. Fairness here did not mean equality. It meant effectiveness. A strong adult might receive less because their body could endure longer. A sick person might receive more because recovery depended on it. Decisions shifted as conditions changed. Nothing was fixed. Survival required flexibility rather than rigid rules. What mattered most was transparency. Everyone knew how much remained. Hidden reserves bred resentment and panic. Panic destroyed discipline. Communities learned that visible scarcity was safer than imagined abundance. When water was seen and measured openly, behavior adjusted naturally. Sharing water also controlled behavior. Knowing that supply was limited discouraged unnecessary movement and speech. People rested more, waited longer, and conserved energy. Distribution systems reinforced restraint without instruction. The rules shaped action quietly. Children learned these systems early. They watched portions being counted, time being measured, stones being moved. They learned patience before they learned explanation. Complaints were rare. Hunger and thirst were accepted conditions, not emergencies. This acceptance reduced chaos. The emotional weight of these decisions was heavy. Watching someone drink while another waited tested bonds deeply. But the desert did not allow avoidance. Refusing to decide meant losing control entirely. Those who survived accepted the burden of choice rather than surrendering it. Conflict still occurred. Fear sometimes overrode discipline. In such moments, leaders intervened quickly, not with punishment, but with clarity. They reminded the group what failure looked like. Failure meant everyone losing water sooner. This reminder was usually enough. The measure of justice became visible in outcomes. If children survived, the system worked. If elders endured long enough to guide decisions, it worked. If the group reached water together, the method was justified. Moral arguments held little weight compared to survival itself. Outsiders often judged these practices harshly, imagining cruelty or favoritism. From within the desert, they appeared logical. Water allocation was triage, not generosity. It mirrored decisions made in illness or injury, where resources are directed where they matter most. These systems also reduced guilt. When water ran out and someone died, the group did not blame a single person. The system had been followed. Limits had been respected. Loss was mourned, but not weaponized. This prevented fragmentation at the worst moments. Sharing water reshaped identity. People stopped thinking of my water and began thinking of our survival. This shift reduced panic-driven behavior. The desert punished selfishness quickly. Cooperation extended endurance. The methods used were simple, because complexity failed under stress. Counting, timing, and visible markers required little explanation and functioned even when thinking slowed. Simplicity preserved order. As conditions worsened, portions shrank. At extreme limits, water was sometimes used to wet lips rather than swallowed. Moistening the mouth reduced distress without draining reserves. These adjustments were made quietly, without announcement. The body responded to this discipline. Thirst remained, but panic softened. Energy was conserved. Decisions improved. The group moved as a unit, rather than fragmenting into desperate individuals. When water returned, distribution loosened slowly. Overdrinking caused sickness. Recovery required moderation even after danger passed. Habits formed in scarcity did not vanish immediately. They lingered as protection against the next crisis. These practices were remembered more than any route or well. People forgot distances. They did not forget how water was shared when survival hung in the balance. Memory preserved discipline. In the Sahara, survival was never about individual strength. It was about collective judgment under pressure. Water distribution revealed character not through generosity, but through restraint. What remains striking is how unceremonious these decisions were. No speeches marked them. No records preserved them. They occurred repeatedly, quietly, shaping outcomes without recognition. The desert accepted them without comment. When distribution failed, collapse followed quickly. Hoarding led to exhaustion, conflict, and death. These failures reinforced memory. Communities that endured did so by learning from them. Water measured by stones or seconds turned chaos into order. Order preserved life long enough for a chance to return. Chance, in the desert, was often all that remained. Sharing water transformed survival into a collective calculation rather than a personal struggle. These systems reduced panic by making limits visible and unavoidable. Beyond human judgment, simple tools became silent arbiters of life. Filtering water in the Sahara was not about purity. It was about reducing harm, just enough for the body to accept what it had to take. When water appeared cloudy, bitter, or foul-smelling, People did not expect to make it clean. They expected to make it survivable. The difference mattered. Sources found through digging, carcasses, or shallow pools rarely offered clear water. Sand, organic matter, and decay mixed into everything. Drinking it directly often led to sickness that wasted more fluid than it provided. Those who survived learned to slow this damage by passing water through layers of simple materials gathered from the land itself. Sand formed the first barrier. Coarse grains caught larger debris and grit, removing what could tear the throat or upset the stomach immediately. Fine sand followed, settling particles the eye could not track. People selected sand carefully, avoiding areas contaminated by waste or decay. Clean-looking sand did not guarantee safety, but it reduced risk. The arrangement mattered. Layers were built deliberately, not poured together. Larger stones were placed at the bottom to keep space open. Coarser sand rested above them. Finer sand came next. Each layer served a purpose. Rushing this structure collapses its function. Patience preserved it. Charcoal added another layer of protection. Burned wood, crushed into small pieces, absorbed odors and some toxins. It did not make water safe by modern standards, but it softened what the body rejected most strongly. Water that smelled less offensive was easier to swallow slowly, reducing the chance of vomiting. That difference alone justified the effort. Charcoal was never used raw. It was cleaned of ash and crushed carefully. Too much turned the water black and gritty. Too little offered no benefit. Experience taught balance. The goal was not clarity, it was tolerance. Cloth or moss completed the system. Fabric caught remaining particles and held the structure together. Moss, when available, added another natural filter, trapping fine sediment while allowing water through. These materials were cleaned when possible, but often reused out of necessity. Cleanliness was relative. Function was absolute. The entire filter was built slowly, often in silence. Hands moved deliberately. Each step conserved energy, talking wasted breath and moisture. People worked close to the ground, keeping the structure shaded. Heat damaged effectiveness by speeding evaporation and bacterial growth. Water passed through the filter gradually. Pouring too quickly overwhelmed the layers, carrying debris through. Those who survived learned to wait. Drips were preferred over streams. Time mattered more than volume. A single cup taken safely outweighed several, swallowed in haste. The result was imperfect. The water remained warm, sometimes discolored, sometimes unpleasant, but it was less likely to provoke immediate illness. The body accepted it more readily. That acceptance mattered more than taste. This practice rarely stood alone. Filtered water was combined with restraint, stillness, and careful intake. People drank slowly, watching for nausea or weakness. At the first sign of rejection, they stopped. Stopping preserved what remained. Children were taught to respect this process. They learned that clear water was rare and that filtered water was a compromise, not a comfort. Complaints were discouraged gently. Waste was corrected immediately. Every drop required effort. The filter itself was temporary. Materials shifted. Sand compacted. Charcoal lost effectiveness. After several uses, the structure was rebuilt or adjusted. Maintenance mattered. Neglect turned protection into illusion. Modern observers sometimes dismiss these methods as primitive. Those who relied on them understood their limits precisely. Filtering did not remove all danger. It reduced immediate harm enough to allow waiting, rest, or movement at safer times. The emotional effect of filtering was subtle but important. It restored a sense of control. Taking action, even imperfect action, calmed the mind. Calm preserved judgment. Judgment preserved life. Not all water was worth filtering. Some sources were abandoned entirely. Smell, color, and location guided decisions. Knowing when not to drink mattered as much as knowing how to filter. The desert punished indiscriminate effort. Charcoal also served as memory. People remembered where good charcoal came from, which wood burned cleanly, and which left residue. This knowledge traveled quietly, passed through observation rather than instruction. The simplicity of the materials hid the discipline required. Building a filter while dehydrated demanded focus. Mistakes were costly. Those who rushed often worsened their condition. Survivors slowed down, even when time felt scarce. This method extended the usefulness of otherwise dangerous sources. It turned marginal water into a bridge rather than a dead end. That bridge did not lead far, but it led far enough. Filtering reshaped behavior. People planned stops around rebuilding filters. They conserved materials. They avoided contaminating sources unnecessarily. Each action reinforced the next. When water improved, filtering was reduced but not abandoned. Habits formed in scarcity lingered as protection. Overconfidence after relief caused sickness just as surely as thirst before it. The desert rewarded those who respected process over outcome. Filtering required accepting that results would be limited. That acceptance prevented disappointment and panic. In the Sahara, survival rarely came from finding perfect water. It came from making imperfect water tolerable without destroying the body. Filters embodied this compromise. They also reflected a broader pattern. Every method used here reduced risk without eliminating it. Each layer bought time for the next decision. Survival was assembled piece by piece. When filters failed, people turned to harsher options. Remembering the order mattered. Jumping too far ahead shortened endurance. The sequence preserved life. What remains striking is how unremarkable this practice was. No ceremony marked it. No pride accompanied it. It was done because it worked often enough to remember. Filtering turned dangerous water into something the body could accept without immediate rejection. Its value lay in patience and layering, rather than clarity. Beyond filtering, moisture was sometimes gathered from the air itself when movement ceased. Recovering water from the body itself was never a clever trick. It was an admission that nothing else remained. When wells failed, digging yielded dust, and movement promised only collapse, people turned inward. The body, already losing moisture with every breath and bead of sweat, became the last source left to manage rather than abandon. Sweat and breath carried water away continuously. In the Sahara, this loss happened even at rest. Every exhale releases vapor. Every patch of skin exposed to air surrendered moisture. Survival depended on slowing this escape and, when possible, capturing a portion of it before it vanished into the heat. Shelter changed its purpose at this stage. A tent was no longer just shade, it became a container. Low, enclosed structures trapped humid air close to the ground. Warm breath and sweat raised moisture levels inside, creating conditions where condensation could form when temperatures shifted. The space felt stifling, uncomfortable, and unpleasant. Comfort was irrelevant. Retention mattered. People sealed openings carefully. Gaps invited airflow that carried moisture away. Cloth was weighted with stones. Entrances were kept narrow. Inside, movement was reduced to a minimum. Every unnecessary action increases heat and loss. Stillness turned the body into a slow generator rather than a leaking vessel. Plastic or treated skins, when available, were used deliberately. Hung loosely or stretched along the inner surface of a shelter, they collected condensation as temperatures dropped. Droplets formed gradually, sliding downward under their own weight. The sound was faint, almost imagined. Each drop represented recovery, not abundance. The collection required patience. Rushing disturbed the system. Touching surfaces too often scattered moisture back into the air. People waited until enough droplets gathered to justify action. Cloth or hands were used to guide water into a container or directly to the mouth. The amounts were small. Expectations remained low. Breathing was controlled throughout. Slow, shallow breaths reduced loss while increasing humidity within the enclosed space. Talking stopped entirely. Silence preserved moisture and focus. Panic increased breathing and ruined the balance. Those who survived learned to calm themselves deliberately, slowing the body when instinct urged the opposite. Sweat, usually an enemy, became part of the system. Covered skin retained moisture, allowing evaporation to occur within the shelter rather than outside it. This raised the humidity further. The sensation was unpleasant, even distressing. Skin remained damp, clothing clung, heat lingered, endurance replaced comfort. This method worked best at night or during temperature drops. As the air cooled, moisture condensed more readily. People planned stillness around these periods. Daytime attempts were less effective, often exhausting without reward. Timing mattered as much as construction. The system was simple, but fragile. Too much movement caused humidity. Too much sealing caused overheating. Balance was learned through trial and memory. Mistakes were corrected quietly. Complaints wasted breath and water. Children were positioned carefully. Their smaller bodies lost moisture quickly, but they also produced less heat. Adults often placed themselves closer to collection surfaces, absorbing discomfort to increase recovery. These choices were made without discussion. Survival reorganized priorities automatically. The water collected this way was clean in comparison to many other sources. It carried no sand, no decay. Its purity was relative, but its acceptance by the body was immediate. Even a few mouthfuls eased dryness and sharpened thought. That clarity mattered. This practice did not replace water sources. It delayed the moment when harsher methods became necessary. It bought time for dawn, for cooler air, for reconsideration. In the Sahara, time was often more valuable than distance. Outsiders sometimes imagined this method as efficient. Those who depended on it knew better. Entire nights could pass with almost nothing gained. Failure was common. Success was measured in drops. Yet drops mattered when nothing else existed. The psychological effect was significant. Capturing moisture restored a sense of agency. The body was no longer only losing, it was also recovering. That shift reduced despair. Reduced despair improved judgment. Judgment preserved life. This method also reinforced restraint. Those who moved too much or tried to accelerate results lost more than they gained. Stillness became skill rather than weakness. Waiting became action. Modern descriptions often frame this as a technique. In practice, it was a posture toward survival. It required acceptance of discomfort, patience without reward, and trust that small gains could matter later. The system demanded constant attention. Plastic sagged. Cloth absorbed too much. Condensation shifted with temperature. People adjusted quietly, without urgency. Urgency destroyed balance. Even when some water was collected, intake remained slow. Drinking too quickly increases heat and sweating. Sips were spaced carefully. The goal was stabilization, not relief. This method rarely stood alone. It is combined with cooling strategies, food-based hydration, and strict stillness. Each supported the other. Using it while walking or digging defeated its purpose. What made this approach viable was its simplicity. It used what was already present: breath, sweat, shade, and patience. Nothing new was introduced. Survival depended on managing loss rather than finding gain. The desert tolerated this method because it asked nothing from the land. It took only what the body itself released. This alignment reduced risk. It did not provoke the environment further. When the system failed, it signaled a narrowing of options. People recognized this moment quietly. Decisions hardened. Other measures, harsher and riskier, moved closer. Those who lived through nights like this remembered the waiting more than the water. Waiting defined survival as endurance rather than movement. The desert favored those who understood that difference. In the Sahara, survival often meant turning inward before turning outward again. Capturing breath and sweat represented that turning point. This method slowed loss by reclaiming what the body released without pause. Its success depended on stillness, timing, and control rather than effort. At an earlier age, endurance was taught as a skill long before thirst could be questioned. Children in the Sahara did not learn survival through instruction alone. They learned it through routine, correction, and observation, long before they understood the reasons behind it. Thirst was not introduced as an enemy to fight, but as a condition to manage quietly. From an early age, children were guided toward habits that reduced loss rather than chased relief. Water was never framed as something to consume freely. It was framed as something to respect. Children were taught that drinking was an action with consequences. Every swallow shortened what remained for later. This understanding was not explained in words. It was demonstrated daily. Cups were small, portions were measured, waiting was normalized. One of the earliest lessons involved stillness. Children learned to sit without fidgeting, to rest without complaint. Excess movement was discouraged gently but consistently. Running was limited. The play was quiet and brief. These limits were not presented as punishment. They were part of the environment. The desert enforced them whether adults intervened or not. Sleep became a tool. Children were encouraged to sleep more during the day, especially during the heat. Sleep reduced breathing, reduced movement, and slowed loss. Waking hours were adjusted around temperature rather than curiosity. Naps were not optional. They were protective. The body conserved itself, while the mind rested. Eating followed similar rules. Meals were slow, chewing was deliberate. Children were taught to pause between bites, to feel moisture rather than hunger. Food that increased thirst was limited. Sweetness was controlled. Salt was rare. These choices shaped the body's responses over time. Children learned to recognize early signs of dehydration without panic. Dry lips, fatigue, irritability, these were noticed and managed quietly. They were not treated as emergencies unless they became severe. This calm prevented fear-driven behavior that wasted energy and water. Adults modeled restraint constantly. Children watched elders refuse water, even when visibly uncomfortable. This example carried more weight than instruction. It showed that endurance was possible. It also showed that suffering did not require complaint. Silence preserved strength. Mistakes were corrected without anger. A child who drank too quickly was not scolded loudly. The consequence arrived naturally later, when thirst returned sooner. Memory is formed through experience. The lesson stayed. Education in this context did not separate physical survival from emotional control. Children learned to regulate frustration, boredom, and fear alongside thirst. Emotional outbursts increased breathing and sweating. Calm preserved moisture. Self-control became a survival skill. This upbringing reshaped perception. Thirst was not always a signal to drink. Sometimes it was a signal to stop, to rest, to shade oneself. Children learned to interpret bodily signals differently from those raised in abundance. This interpretation reduced unnecessary action. Outsiders often misunderstand this practice, imagining cruelty or neglect. From within the desert, it appeared as preparation. Children who learned restraint early survived longer when scarcity arrived. Those who did not often struggled later. The environment reinforced these lessons continuously. Heat punished impulsive movement. Sun rewarded shade. Waiting produced better outcomes than searching blindly. Children absorbed these patterns without formal teaching. Water sharing also shaped childhood behavior. Children learned that others depended on their restraint. Drinking more than allotted harmed the group. This awareness fostered responsibility early. Survival became collective rather than individual. Stories reinforced these habits. Elders spoke of times when water ran out, when waiting saved lives, and when impatience killed quietly. These stories were not dramatic. They were factual. Children listened without interruption. Memory carried the warning forward. As children grew, these habits became instinctive. They moved less during the heat without thinking. They drank slowly without being told. Their bodies adapted to reduced intake. Adaptation did not remove thirst. It changed the response. This adaptation carried limits. Children were not immune to dehydration. They required protection and monitoring. Adults adjusted portions carefully. Priority was given when necessary. Discipline never replaced care. It supported it. The long-term effect of this upbringing was resilience. Adults who had learned restraint early handled scarcity with less panic. They recognized danger sooner and wasted less time reacting emotionally. This advantage mattered. Sleep patterns remained central. Adults who learned to sleep through heat as children relied on that skill throughout life. Sleep conserved water more reliably than movement ever could. The practice of teaching children not to drink freely was not about denial. It was about timing. Drinking at the wrong moment worsened outcomes. Drinking at the right moment extended survival. Children learned this distinction early. Modern perspectives often equate access with safety. In the Sahara, access without discipline increased risk. Children raised there learned that availability did not mean permission. Permission followed judgment. This education also shaped respect for water itself. Water was not taken for granted. It was observed, measured, and remembered. Children grew into adults who wasted little and planned carefully. What stands out is how quietly this knowledge was passed. No ceremonies marked it. No written rules preserved it. Habit carried it forward. Habit survived when instruction failed. In extreme conditions, these lessons became decisive. Adults who had learned restraint early endured longer without breaking. They waited when others panicked. They slept when others searched. They survived more often. The desert did not reward strength alone. It rewarded control learned early and reinforced daily. Children who learned this grew into adults who understood survival as management rather than conquest. This upbringing carried a cost. Childhood comfort was limited. Spontaneity was restrained. Yet the alternative was loss. The desert offered no compromise. In the Sahara, survival education began before memory formed. Children learned not by choice, but by environment. That learning stayed. These lessons shaped endurance by teaching restraint before scarcity demanded it. They turned thirst into a signal for control rather than immediate action. Weather itself became a teacher, revealing patterns only those who watched could read. The weather in the Sahara was never something to be checked. It was something to be felt, watched, and remembered. Long before instruments existed, people learned that the sky and wind carried warnings quietly. Missing those warnings meant moving at the wrong time, resting in the wrong place, or waiting when movement was required. Survival depended on recognizing change before it arrived. Hot wind was one of the most important signs. When it arrived suddenly and without relief, people paid attention. This wind did not cool the body. It pressed against the skin, carrying dust and dryness, increasing discomfort rather than easing it. Elders recognized this as a shift rather than a condition. Hot wind often preceded sandstorms, and sometimes rain followed those storms. Rain was rare, but the possibility changed decisions immediately. Movement slowed or stopped when such winds appeared. Digging was delayed. Travel routes were adjusted. People avoided open areas where sand could blind and bury. The wind itself carried information. Its direction, speed, and persistence mattered. A brief gust meant little. A sustained flow meant preparation. Clouds were watched with equal care. In the Sahara, clouds did not always bring rain. Many passed without consequence, yet their height, thickness, and movement revealed patterns. Low, heavy clouds that lingered near the horizon were treated differently from high, fast-moving ones. People learned which formations promised change and which were illusions. The sun also served as a guide. Its position influenced travel routes and timing. Certain paths were safe only when the sun followed a predictable arc. When its path shifted due to seasonal change, routes changed with it. Shadows were read not just for time, but for orientation. A misjudged angle could lead travelers away from shade or toward exposed ground. Morning and evening light offered subtle clues. Haze near the horizon suggested moisture suspended in the air. This did not mean rain would fall, but it indicated atmospheric change. People adjusted expectations quietly. They did not chase hope. They prepared for the possibility. Humidity was sensed rather than measured. Skin felt it first. Cloth behaved differently. Breath condensed faintly at dawn. These small signs suggested that dew might form, or that underground moisture was closer than expected. Decisions were shaped by these sensations, not by certainty. Animals reacted to the weather before humans did. Changes in their behavior reinforced the interpretation. Birds flew lower or gathered differently. Insects emerged or vanished. Livestock grew restless or lethargic. These reactions confirmed what wind and sky hinted at. People combined signals rather than trusting anyone alone. This knowledge was not taught formally. It was absorbed through repetition. Children watched adults pause unexpectedly, alter direction without explanation, or wait through conditions that seemed unchanged. Later, they learned why. Memory is formed through outcome rather than instruction. Mistakes were costly but educational. A storm misread led to lost time, damaged supplies, or injury. Survivors remembered these failures vividly. Stories preserved them. Each error refined judgment for those who lived long enough to learn. Weather knowledge also guided restraint. Sometimes the correct decision was to do nothing. Waiting through a day of oppressive heat preserved strength for a cooler night. Moving during the wrong window multiplied the loss. Recognizing when the weather favored stillness mattered as much as recognizing when it favored travel. Rain, when it came, rarely announced itself clearly. It arrived briefly, unevenly, and often far from where it was needed. People did not expect to catch it directly. They prepared instead to benefit indirectly. Depressions were noted. Digging sites were marked. Routes shifted toward areas likely to collect runoff. The sound of distant thunder carried meaning. It did not guarantee rain nearby, but it suggested atmospheric instability. People listened carefully at night, judging distance and direction. This listening influenced where they rested and how they oriented shelters. Smell also mattered. The scent of damp earth, faint and easily missed, sometimes preceded moisture. Those raised in the desert recognized it instinctively. Outsiders dismissed it as imagination. Experience confirmed it often enough to remember. Seasonal memory guided interpretation. Certain months carried predictable patterns. Winds returned, sun angles shifted, clouds behaved similarly year after year, though never identically. Elders carried this memory, shaping group decisions quietly. Weather reading influenced risk tolerance. When conditions suggested stability, people moved further. When uncertainty increased, margins tightened. Water was rationed more strictly. Shelter was reinforced. Every action is adjusted to the perceived state of the air. This practice also reduced panic. Understanding that discomfort signaled change rather than immediate danger calmed behavior. Calm reduced waste. Waste shortened survival. Emotional discipline supported physical endurance. Modern tools measure weather precisely, but they cannot replace attention entirely. Instruments fail. Batteries die. The desert remains indifferent. Those who survived longest trusted what they felt and saw more than what they hoped. What defined this knowledge was humility. No one claimed certainty. Predictions were spoken cautiously or not at all. People acted without announcement. Outcomes validated choices or corrected them. Weather reading also preserved cooperation. Shared interpretation reduced disagreement. When elders adjusted plans, others followed without argument. The debate wasted time and energy. Trust preserved cohesion. The desert punished arrogance quickly. Those who assumed understanding without experience were corrected harshly. Survivors respected patterns they did not fully control. This knowledge blurred the line between environment and instruction. The desert taught directly. Humans learned by paying attention long enough. In the Sahara, the weather did not need to be accurate. It needed to be anticipated, just enough to avoid disaster. That narrow margin defined survival. Those who mastered this did not feel powerful. They felt cautious. Caution kept them alive. Reading the weather turned discomfort into a warning rather than confusion. These interpretations guided movement, waiting, and restraint without promise. Direction itself shifted when the air hinted that endurance would be tested soon. Night travel in the Sahara was not chosen for speed. It was chosen for preservation. When daylight burned moisture out of the body with every step, darkness offered a different bargain. The air cooled, the ground released heat, and the loss slowed. Movement became possible, without immediate penalty. People waited for the sun to fall completely. Twilight still carried heat. Only when shadows merged and the land dimmed did they begin. The first steps were cautious. Eyes adjusted slowly. Familiar landmarks vanished. What replaced them was a quieter map built from memory, stars, and subtle ground changes felt through the feet. The body responded almost immediately. Breathing eased. Sweat slowed. Thirst did not disappear, but it sharpened less quickly. Each hour of movement at night saved water that would have been lost by day. This saving accumulated silently, extending endurance without adding burden. Camels defined the rhythm of night travel. Their bodies tolerated long, steady movement in darkness better than any human. They walked without pause, guided by handlers who trusted their instincts as much as their own. A camel that slowed or veered signaled danger or exhaustion. People listened. Ignoring these signs costs lives. Routes were planned differently at night. Straight lines were less important than consistency. People avoided obstacles that were manageable by day but dangerous in the darkness. Soft ground, hidden depressions, and scattered rock fields demanded attention. Progress was measured in patience rather than distance. The sky replaced landmarks. Stars guided direction when memory failed. Certain constellations marked seasons and routes. People did not name them formally. They recognized shapes and angles, adjusting movement as the sky rotated. Losing orientation at night meant wasting hours, correcting it later. Sound carried farther after dark. Footsteps, breathing, and shifting loads were quieter but clearer. Silence became discipline. Talking stopped. Signals were brief and practiced. Excess noise wasted breath and attention. Attention preserved safety. Humidity increased slightly at night. It was not enough to drink, but it reduced loss. The skin felt less dry. Cloth absorbed moisture rather than releasing it. This subtle change mattered over hours of movement. It reduced strain without effort. Rest periods were planned carefully. Stopping too often cooled the body excessively. Stopping too little invited fatigue. Balance was learned through experience. People watched each other for signs of weakness. Support replaced competition. The group moved at the pace of endurance, not strength. Predators were considered, but rarely feared. Most animals avoided groups. Fire was used sparingly, if at all. Light attracted attention and disrupted night vision. Darkness offered concealment as well as relief. Night travel demanded trust. Paths chosen earlier were followed without re-evaluation. Doubt caused hesitation. Hesitation wasted time and water. Decisions made before darkness were respected, unless danger was obvious. Children were positioned carefully within the group. They walked near adults, shielded from uneven ground. Their pace set limits. Pushing children too far defeated the purpose of night movement. Preserving them preserved the future. Food intake was adjusted. Eating lightly before movement prevented overheating. Small portions were taken during rest. Water was sipped sparingly. The goal was steadiness, not comfort. The desert at night felt different, but it was not gentle. Cold arrived quickly before dawn. People prepared for this shift, adding layers without trapping heat. Misjudging temperature caused shivering, which wasted energy and moisture. Balance again mattered. Navigation errors were costly. A wrong turn could lead to exposed terrain by morning. People aimed to reach shelter or favorable ground before first light. Dawn was not welcomed mid-journey. It signaled urgency. The transition back to stillness was deliberate. As the sky lightened, movement slowed and stopped. Shade was sought immediately. The body needed time to cool and recover. Collapsing carelessly wasted the gains earned overnight. Night travel reshaped the perception of distance. What seemed impossible by day became manageable in darkness. Not because the land changed, but because loss slowed. This shift altered planning fundamentally. Journeys were divided by nights rather than days. Modern travelers often underestimate this method, assuming darkness increases danger. In the Sahara, daylight was the greater threat. Heat punished movement more severely than darkness punished navigation. The psychological effect of night travel was significant. Darkness reduced anxiety by narrowing focus. The horizon disappeared. Only the next step mattered. This simplicity preserved mental energy. Stars offered reassurance. Their consistency anchored movement. Even when clouds obscured them, memory filled gaps. People trusted patterns learned over the years. Trust reduced hesitation. When night movement failed, the cost was immediate. Dehydration accelerated by dawn. Errors became visible under sunlight. Survivors remembered these failures and adjusted plans. Memory refined practice. Night travel was never continuous. It alternated with waiting, digging, filtering, and restraint. It fit into a sequence of survival methods, each supporting the next. Used alone, it failed. Used within a sequence, it extended life. What remains striking is how ordinary this practice became. No heroism accompanied it. It was routine, repeated whenever conditions allowed. Routine preserved life more reliably than bravery. The desert did not reward haste. It rewarded timing. Night provided the timing that day denied. Those who learned to move in darkness carried that knowledge quietly. They did not boast. They remembered outcomes. Survival favored those who adjusted without complaint. In the Sahara, distance was negotiated hour by hour. Night made negotiation possible. Night movement reduced loss by trading visibility for endurance. Its success depended on timing, restraint, and trust rather than speed. Ahead, the smallest creatures revealed moisture where human senses failed. Taking water from insects and reptiles was not an act of ingenuity. It was an act of reduction. When every other option had narrowed or failed, people turned to the smallest carriers of moisture left alive in the desert. These creatures survived where others did not, and their bodies held what the land refused to give freely. Insects in the Sahara lived close to the edge of dehydration, yet many retained fluid efficiently. Beetles, larvae, and certain ants stored moisture within their bodies, protected by shells or tissues that slowed evaporation. People learned which ones to approach and which to avoid. Bright colors often warned of toxins. Dull, earth-toned bodies were examined more carefully. The act itself was brief and deliberate. Insects were crushed quickly, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Hesitation wasted opportunity. The resulting paste was pressed through cloth or between fingers, and the liquid that emerged was collected or consumed immediately. There was no attempt to save it. Delay invited loss. Reptiles offered slightly more promise, but at a higher risk. Lizards and small snakes contained fluid in muscles and organs that could be extracted. Catching them required energy and attention. Those who survived chose moments carefully, avoiding long pursuits. A short capture that yielded little was preferable to exhaustion that yielded nothing. The water obtained this way was never clean. It carried taste, odor, and the risk of illness. People drank it slowly, watching for rejection. Vomiting meant failure. Failure here cannot be recovered. The body was already depleted. Every attempt carried consequences. This method demanded emotional control. Revulsion came naturally. Overcoming it required acceptance rather than force. People did not dwell on the act. They focused on the outcome. Survival narrowed perspective until disgust lost relevance. Children were rarely asked to perform this task. Adults handled it when possible, sharing small amounts afterward. When children participated, it was guided and brief. The lesson was not a technique. It was understood that survival sometimes required abandoning comfort entirely. The desert offered few chances for repetition. Insects scattered quickly. Reptiles hid. Success depended on recognizing when to stop searching. Overhunting wasted energy and yielded diminishing returns. Those who survived learned to take what was available and move on. This practice was never preferred. It followed many gentler layers, carrying water, collecting dew, filtering, restraint, waiting. Only when those failed did people turn to living carriers. Sequence mattered. Jumping too early to this option shortened endurance later. Illness followed often. Diarrhea, fever, and weakness appeared hours or days afterward. Yet these consequences came later than thirst. Later mattered. Delayed suffering was preferable to immediate collapse. Survival calculations here were brutal and precise. People remembered which species caused fewer problems. This knowledge traveled quietly. Elders corrected mistakes without explanation. Outcomes are taught more effectively than instruction. Memory preserved what worked often enough. The psychological effect of this method lingered. Survivors remembered the taste more vividly than the relief. It marked a boundary crossed. After this, the desert felt closer, less abstract. Life reduced to function. Outsiders often imagine this act as desperation bordering on madness. Those who lived it understood it as clarity. There were no illusions left to maintain. Survival was stripped to mechanics. Water was water, regardless of source. This method rarely sustained movement. It bought time to wait, to rest, to reconsider. The energy gained was minimal. The water gained was minimal. The time gained could matter enormously. The body responded cautiously. Thirst eased slightly. Thought sharpened briefly. These windows were used to plan rather than push forward blindly. Planning preserved life more reliably than action at this stage. Predators were considered. Handling insects and reptiles distracted attention. People stayed alert, scanning constantly. A moment of inattention could erase any gain. Survival demanded awareness even while performing unpleasant acts. Modern narratives often frame this as a survival skill. In practice, it was a last adjustment in a long chain. It did not replace water sources, it postponed the moment when options ended. What stands out is how unremarkable this knowledge was treated. It was not celebrated. It was not taught widely. It existed at the edge, remembered but rarely discussed. Silence protected dignity. The desert did not judge the method. It responded only to outcomes. Those who gained time lived, those who did not die. Morality shifted under pressure. Necessity replaced preference. After such moments, people returned to gentler methods whenever possible. They conserved more carefully. They waited longer. They protected supplies more strictly. Memory sharpened discipline. This practice also reinforced humility. Humans were not superior here. Insects and reptiles survived where humans struggled. Borrowing from them felt like acknowledgement rather than conquest. The Sahara allowed survival through layers of compromise. Each layer removed comfort. This one removed pretense. What remained was function. When this method failed, few options remained. People recognized this quietly. Panic did not help. Calm preserved clarity until the end. Those who lived through it rarely spoke of it later. They spoke instead of waiting, of timing, of restraint. The smallest carriers of water were remembered without detail. In the desert, survival did not belong to the strongest. It belonged to those who accepted reduction without resistance. This method reduced survival to its smallest margins, where even insects became reservoirs. Its value lay in buying time rather than restoring strength. When even this failed, endurance depended on how water was shared among the last who remained. The well was already failing when they arrived, and everyone could see it. The stone walls were dark with dampness but offered no clear pool. Water did not rest there anymore. It appeared slowly, seeping through mud and cracks, forming thin layers that vanished as soon as fingers touched them. Leaving was no longer an option. The nearest known source was too far, and the bodies were already too weak. Staying meant accepting a slow test of control rather than a quick escape. The group understood that the well would not refill in any meaningful way. No one spoke of waiting for a miracle. They said only of time. How many days could be stretched out of what remained? Survival stopped being about finding water and became about managing its disappearance. Every action was judged by whether it slowed the loss or accelerated it. They organized themselves around the well, not as owners of it, but as witnesses. Someone was always watching, not to guard it from others, but to observe when moisture appeared. When a thin layer formed, it was collected carefully with a spoon, a shell, or a folded cloth. The amount gathered was humiliatingly small. Still, it was counted. Water was divided by rotation, not by need. Each person drank in turn, one spoonful at a time. When the rotation ended, it ended for everyone. This rule mattered more than kindness. Kindness created an argument. Rotation created order. Order kept people from fighting when their bodies began to fail. Children were the hardest to watch. Their mouths dried faster, their eyes dulled sooner. Adults shielded them from the sight of the well whenever possible. Seeing water increased desire, and desire broke discipline. When children asked, they were answered quietly, without promise. Promises were dangerous. As thirst deepened, they used sand. Wet sand was pressed gently against lips and gums. The mouth cooled briefly, tricking the body into feeling relief. No water was swallowed. The act was deception, but a necessary one. Panic burned water faster than thirst ever could. Sleep became another tool. During the hottest hours, people slept as much as possible. Sleep slowed breathing and movement. It did not remove thirst, but it reduced loss. Nights were restless. Dreams were shallow and broken. Waking brought disappointment, but also another chance to endure. They stopped washing entirely. Dust layered on skin. Sweat dried and stayed. Cleanliness no longer mattered. Every motion that did not preserve water was abandoned. Even speech became rare. Talking is wasted breath. Silence saved it. As days passed, weakness appeared unevenly. Some bodies endured longer, others failed quickly. The group adjusted without discussion. When someone could no longer sit upright or swallow safely, their turn shortened. This was not debated. Debate would have destroyed what little trust remained. By the end of the first week, illness was visible. Lips cracked, eyes lost focus, hands shook when lifted. Still, the rotation continued. Breaking it would have ended everything sooner. Trust in the system mattered more than comfort. Predators passed nearby, drawn by stillness and scent. The group did not chase them away. Energy was too precious. Fire was minimal. Smoke wasted breath. Night passed quietly, measured in shallow breaths and shifting shadows. After the second week, 2 members weakened beyond recovery. They stopped waking fully. Their breathing slowed until it ceased. Their turns were given to others without ceremony. No one announced the change. Death arrived quietly, as it often does in the desert. The remaining members adjusted again. Portions grew slightly larger, not as a reward, but because fewer mouths remained. This calculation was heavy. Survival did not soften the loss. It required accepting it without protest. The well itself became something other than a source. It became a center. Sitting near it gave structure to days. Watching seepage replaced conversation. Time stretched and thinned, marked only by light and shadow. By the third week, only 2 were strong enough to move. The others lay still, breathing shallowly. The last moisture was used to wet lips rather than swallowed. Swallowing risked vomiting. Moistening calmed distress without draining reserves. When rain finally came, it did not fall directly into the well. It soaked the ground nearby. The survivors dug shallow channels with bare hands, guiding muddy water toward a small depression. They drank slowly, carefully. Overdrinking at this stage could have killed them. 4 did not survive long enough to see this moment. 2 did. The difference was not strength. It was restraint held longer than comfort allowed. Stories remembered this event not for the deaths, but for the method. Rotation prevented chaos. Deception of thirst preserved discipline. Acceptance allowed waiting. These elements mattered more than the well itself. Outsiders often focus on numbers. Those who lived it remembered the sequence. Each decision followed another. Breaking the sequence would have ended everything sooner. This survival was not heroic. It was controlled. It required enduring discomfort without reaction. Reaction wasted water. Control preserved it. The desert offered no forgiveness. It responded only to management. The group that survived did so by turning scarcity into structure. When water returned, habits remained. Drinking was slow. Sharing continued. Memory shaped behavior long after danger passed. The well never fully recovered. It remained shallow and unreliable. The survivors remembered this and avoided dependence on a single source afterward. The lesson stayed. In the Sahara, survival sometimes meant outlasting others through discipline rather than speed. Endurance decided outcomes quietly, without witnesses. This endurance stemmed from turning scarcity into a routine rather than surrendering. Order replaced hope when hope became dangerous. When water was gone, belief became the only thing left to hold people in place. Belief entered survival when every practical method had narrowed to its limit. It did not arrive as hope for rescue or expectation of rain. It appeared as endurance of waiting without breaking. In the Sahara, belief was not a promise. It was a posture held when nothing else moved. People prayed, but not for water. They prayed for steadiness, for the ability to remain still without panic. For clarity, when the body weakened. Prayer here did not demand answers. It slowed breathing, focused attention, and gave structure to hours that otherwise dissolved into thirst and fear. Words spoken quietly carried weight. Repetition mattered more than meaning. Familiar phrases calmed the mind, anchoring it to rhythm rather than outcome. This rhythm slowed the body's response to stress. Slower response meant less loss. Belief became a tool, not a comfort. Some sang softly. The songs were not loud or joyful. They were low, repetitive, and almost mechanical. Singing involves regulated breathing. It distracted from the mouth's dryness without encouraging movement. The voice stayed steady, even as the body weakened. Silence returned between verses. Nothing was wasted. These acts did not create water. They preserved the person long enough to wait for it. Waiting, in this context, was not passive. It required resisting impulses that shortened survival. Belief helped restrain those impulses when reason alone weakened. The mind failed before the body. Thirst distorted judgment, turning small discomforts into emergencies. Belief countered this distortion. It reframed waiting as action. It gave meaning to restraint when the body demanded reaction. Children absorbed this early. They watched adults pray without expectation. They listened to songs sung without an audience. They learned that belief did not change the desert, but it changed how the desert was endured. This lesson stayed. Belief also preserved cooperation. When resources were gone, arguments offered no benefit. Shared rituals replaced debate. Everyone knew what came next. This predictability reduced fear. Fear burned water faster than hunger ever could. The desert offered no confirmation. Prayer did not bring rain on command. Songs did not soften the heat. Belief functioned independently of outcome. Its value lay in stabilizing behavior regardless of the result. Some beliefs were inherited. Others formed spontaneously. Both served the same purpose. They gave the mind something to hold while the body waited. That holding mattered. When belief faltered, collapse followed quickly. People who lost mental structure moved unnecessarily, spoke too much, and drank too fast when water appeared. These actions erased gains made through days of restraint. Belief prevented these failures more reliably than instruction. This belief was not optimism. Optimism anticipates reward. Belief accepted uncertainty. Acceptance reduced emotional spikes that drained energy. Energy preserved life. Even those who did not pray adopted a ritual, counting breaths, repeating movements, watching shadows. These patterns anchored attention. Anchored attention slowed loss. The body responded subtly. Heart rate steadied, breathing slowed, muscles relaxed. These changes did not remove thirst, but they reduced its damage. The mind guided the body toward endurance. Belief also softened memory. People who survived remembered waiting more than suffering. Belief reframed hardship as a passage rather than a punishment. This reframing allowed recovery later without bitterness. Outsiders often dismiss belief as irrelevant in survival. Those who endured scarcity understood its function precisely. Belief filled the gap where control ended. It held behavior together when options disappeared. In the Sahara, belief did not replace water. It replaced panic. Panic destroyed the sequence. The sequence preserved life. When water finally returned, belief did not vanish immediately. People drank slowly. They continued rituals. Abrupt relief caused illness. Gradual transition preserved recovery. Belief moderated return, as it had moderated waiting. Those who lived through extreme scarcity carried belief forward quietly. They did not preach it. They practiced it when needed. Memory shaped habit. The desert itself encouraged this posture. It offered no guarantees. It punished expectation. The belief that accepted uncertainty aligned better than the belief that demanded an outcome. In group survival, belief prevented fragmentation. It reminded people that waiting together was safer than acting alone. Isolation increased loss. Togetherness conserved it. Belief also protected dignity. When the body failed, belief allowed people to remain composed. Composure preserved cooperation. Cooperation preserved life. This was not a belief as ideology. It was believed as a regulation. It controlled breath, movement, and response. It was practical in effect, even if abstract in form. When belief failed, the end arrived quickly. Those moments were remembered with caution rather than judgment. Survivors learned that belief required maintenance, like any other method. In the Sahara, belief became the final layer when all others thinned. It did not promise survival, it allowed waiting without collapse. What remains striking is how quietly belief operated. No declarations marked it. No victories were celebrated. It existed in breath, repetition, and stillness. The desert respected this. It allowed endurance when chaos would have destroyed it. Belief aligned human behavior with the desert's demands. Survival did not always reward belief. Some who believed still died. Yet belief increased the chances of lasting long enough for chance to return. Chance, in the desert, was often decisive. Belief was not chosen because it worked every time. It was chosen because nothing else did. Belief did not create water, but it preserved those who waited for it. It held the mind steady when the body weakened beyond certainty. In the final stage, knowledge itself was carried forward so others might endure longer. What remains at the very end of this journey is not a dramatic conclusion, not a final revelation, and not a sense of triumph. It is a quiet realization that survival, especially in the most unforgiving environments, has always depended less on invention and more on attention. Modern science did not arrive in the Sahara to teach people how to survive there. It arrived much later, curious and humbled, to study what had already been practiced successfully for generations. In laboratories and research stations today, engineers study methods for capturing moisture from the air. They calculate dew points, analyze surface textures, and test materials designed to encourage condensation. Panels are angled precisely. Polymers are engineered to cool faster than the surrounding air. Yet the underlying principle mirrors something far simpler. Cloth laid out under an open sky, tents placed low to trap cool air, and long nights spent waiting for droplets so small they barely justified hope. Science refined the mechanism, but it did not invent the patience behind it. Shelter design has followed a similar path. Emergency habitats, space capsules, and disaster response shelters now emphasize humidity retention and minimal airflow loss. Breath and sweat are no longer treated purely as waste, but as resources to be recycled. This logic echoes shelters once built not for comfort, but for control. Those early structures accepted discomfort as the cost of preservation. Modern systems aim to reduce that discomfort, but the strategy remains unchanged. slow loss rather than chase gain. Nutrition science has also turned its attention backward to move forward. Researchers analyze how certain foods release moisture gradually during digestion, how fiber binds water, and how metabolic heat increases thirst. Rations for extreme environments are designed to support hydration rather than simply provide calories. This approach reflects meals eaten slowly at night, dates chewed deliberately, and portions stopped early to prevent later loss. What was once instinctive behavior is now explained through charts and data, but the outcome is the same. Animal movement tracking has become a sophisticated field supported by satellites, drones, and predictive models. Migration patterns are mapped across continents. Subtle shifts in behavior are detected long before human observers would notice them. Yet the conclusions align closely with ancient observation. Life moves toward water. Absence signals danger. Presence narrows uncertainty. Long before technology made these patterns visible at scale, people followed tracks in sand and watched the sky for wings that circled low and returned again and again. Psychological endurance has also entered modern study. Researchers now focus on how stress affects decision-making, how panic accelerates physical decline, and how controlled breathing stabilizes the body. Techniques taught in resilience training resemble rituals once practiced quietly in the desert. Repetition calms the mind. Rhythm slows breathing. Structure replaces chaos. Songs sung softly, prayers repeated without expectation, and silent counting of breaths were not superstition. They were in regulation. This does not mean traditional survival methods were gentle or safe. Many carried real risk. Many lives were lost despite discipline, experience, and restraint. Science offers refinement, testing, and broader protection. It reduces danger where possible and expands the margin for error. Yet it cannot erase the origin of these practices. They were shaped by consequence, not theory, and that distinction matters. One of the most important lessons modern systems rediscover is the concept of sufficiency. Desert survival was never about optimization. It was about having enough water to wait, enough strength to decide, enough clarity to avoid irreversible mistakes. Modern engineering often aims for maximum efficiency. In extreme conditions, sufficiency proves more reliable than excess. Technology can measure humidity precisely. It can simulate heat loss and predict dehydration curves. It can generate models faster than the body can respond, but it cannot decide when waiting is safer than moving. It cannot feel when thirst sharpens judgment rather than demands action. That decision still belongs to the human body and mind. The Sahara was never only a place of deprivation. It was a place of instruction enforced without mercy. Knowledge was not written down or formalized. It was carried in habit, memory, and restraint. Those who survived did not do so because they were extraordinary. They survived because they adjusted their behavior to reality rather than resisting it. Modern science now carries this knowledge outward, translating it into systems designed to protect many rather than a few. Sensors, materials, and survival protocols owe their logic to people who endured without assurance. Remembering that origin matters, it keeps innovation grounded. It prevents the illusion that progress replaces experience rather than building upon it. As this final part settles, there is no lesson to memorize and no action required. The story closes quietly, as survival often does. Knowledge continues forward, passed from lived experience to measured analysis, from memory to model, from desert ground to laboratory bench. What survives is not conquest, but adaptation. Tonight, there is no need to carry the heat, the hunger, or the waiting any further. Let the images loosen their hold, let the details soften. These stories were not meant to alarm. They were meant to show how quietly humans have always adapted when survival demanded it. Breathing can slow down now without effort. Shoulders can drop. The mind can release its vigilance. The desert can remain distant and still where it belongs. What stays with you is the understanding that endurance is often built from restraint, and that even the harshest environments teach patiently to those who listen. You have walked through scarcity, discipline, and belief. You have seen how small, careful decisions extended life when abundance was absent. These were not heroes or legends. They were ordinary people responding thoughtfully to conditions they could not control. Now the journey ends where it began, in stillness. There is nothing left to seek, and nothing left to prove. Only rest remains. Thank you for staying until the final moment. May your thoughts quiet naturally. May your body feel safe enough to let go. May sleep arrive gently, without urgency or resistance. Good night, and rest well.